Chapter 6. A proposition? There was enough skepticism in her eyes to launch a congressional inquiry. But when he reached for her hand, she let him pull her down on the sofa beside him. What do you say we do something about this non-confrontational aspect of your personality? She snorted rather indelicately and managed to detach her hand from his. Short of a lobotomy, I'm not sure there's a whole heck of a lot to be done for it at this late date. We can use the lobotomy as a backup plan, but in the meantime, I had something a little less Dr. Frankensteinish in mind. Like? She tucked her feet, which were now bare, beside her hips on the sofa, effectively creating a wall of resistance between them. He wasn't sure if she was doing it intentionally or if it was just natural. Either way, he decided it was a good thing that one of them was throwing up barriers. Like, how about I teach you? To perform a lobotomy? He gave her a hard look. To defend yourself, woman. She eyed him with caution. But that would mean confrontation. I know. Scary as hell, right? But think about it. It will be me teaching you, not some stranger. She scrunched up her face, tilted her head and, to his way of thinking, looked adorable. This might be a good time to remind you that until last night, we were strangers. I know, he agreed and, hiking a knee up on the sofa, faced her. He met her eyes in earnest. But, Phoebe, do I really seem like a stranger to you? I mean, haven't you felt it too? Heartburn? Yeah. I thought it was the pizza. He let out a long-suffering sigh. I'm talking about a connection. We click. We do? We do. At least we have since you got past the Baron syndrome. When her frown deepened, he drove his point home. Do you know how refreshing it is to be able to sit and talk, just talk, with a woman who doesn't have some ulterior motive for spending time with me? She bit her lower lip, considering. Is this the part when I'm supposed to say, oh, you poor maligned little sex object you? Now, see? That's what I'm talking about. I can't think of a single other woman I could have this conversation with. Because of that maligned sex object thing? He grinned. Because you're a real person who doesn't necessarily want anything from me. I feel comfortable with you. She looked down, plucked at the gauzy fabric of her dress. Like you feel comfortable with a pair of old shoes, huh? His gaze snagged on all those buttons. He let out a breath, shook his head and tried to think about shoes, old shoes, not perfect breasts with tight little nipples that pressed provocatively against gauzy yellow fabric. Kind of like a friend, he said, grounded again, after he zeroed in on the pretty red toenails that peeked out from the folds of her skirt and reminded him how much he could hurt her. Her head came up. A friend? He tilted his head. Don't say we don't know each other well enough. Time isn't necessarily the qualifying factor in friendships. So. She plucked at the skirt again. You want to hang out with me? Yeah. I want to hang out with you, he mimicked. Maybe go to a movie sometime. Take in a ball game. And like tonight, go out for pizza and then sit on your sofa and listen to jazz and just be. You? She suggested softly. Yeah. Just be me. Am I so far off base here? No. No, you're not off base, she said after a while. Their eyes held for a long moment before she pasted on that prickly smile he'd come to recognize as a precursor to one of her wise-ass remarks. She didn't disappoint him. So, buddy, you want to pop the top on a brewski and watch some porn? He wiped a hand over his face, shook his head. You're a funny lady, you know that? That's me. Barrel of laughs. You are. You make me remember why I like my life, why I like what I do. My family, God love them, they want me to come back to the fold, join the Baron law team and settle down. They start on me the moment I walk in the door and pretty much keep it up, with apologies and love, until I blow out of town again. I don't have to worry about that with you, he continued when the frown that had been threatening to crease her wide, intelligent forehead finally furrowed. You don't have any expectations of me. You don't have any designs on me. You don't want me to change or to settle down. And I like that. I really, really like that. What I don't like," he added, sobering, "is the thought of you being vulnerable to Jason Collins." She had nothing to say to that, but that was okay because he had plenty to say on the subject. "So, what do you say? Let me, as your friend, give you something back. Let me teach you how to take care of yourself. Just a few lessons. Simple stuff. And I promise I won't let you hurt me." That finally got a crooked smile out of her. "Well, gee, if you're going to take all the fun out of it." He laughed again, then against his better judgment reached for her hand and folded it in his. "Please, Phoebe. Please let me do this for you. Please, Phoebe. Please let me do this for you." Phoebe mimicked Daniel's words as she straddled the potter's wheel in her basement studio the next afternoon. "Let me, as your friend, teach you how to take care of yourself. Not, let me lay you out on the table and make wild monkey love to you." "You could have said no," she grumbled, bracing her elbow into her hip as she leaned into a 5-pound lump of clay and tried to focus all her concentration on centering it on the wheel. That was the key in throwing pots. You had to center the clay before you continued the process of opening, drilling and forming it into what she decided, in this case, was going to be a vase for Leslie. You could have said, "Look, Daniel, you're really a nice guy and I understand that you don't want any place, let alone any woman, tying you down, but what I want from you involves lip locks and the horizontal tango, not karate chops and pepper spray." She slumped back on her stool, let out a deep breath. Lord, she had it bad. She'd never considered herself a sexual person, certainly not a sexually aggressive one, and yet she didn't have a single thought about Mr. You're a Funny Lady Barone that didn't involve him naked and stretched out over her, or under her or inside her. An electric rush of arousal shot from her breasts to her belly and lower as the erotic picture played out in her mind. Hopeless. From the first moment she'd laid eyes on that incredible face, looked into his sky-blue eyes, heard his gravel and honey voice, she'd wanted him. Now it was worse. Now she knew him. Knew his kindness, his sense of humor, his white knight tendencies. And now she wanted him more, for the beautiful person he was inside as well as out. And he wanted to be her buddy. Yippee-skippy. She should have sent him on his merry way last night with a firm no thank you. But no, she muttered aloud, you had to develop latent masochistic tendencies. Yep. She definitely had them because she'd finally heard herself say, okay. Teach me to break shins and how to bloody noses. Teach me to be bad, Barone. I'm ready to knock some heads. He'd laughed, of course, and said he'd see her today at 3 o'clock for their first lesson. Well, she thought, leaning back over the clay, she hoped that he'd gotten more sleep last night than she had or they could huff and puff and simply blow each other over. She'd pretty much spent her night sifting through 100 scenarios that involved Daniel Barone and how she was going to survive being his friend. Like this ball of clay grasshopper, she said, Allah an old but, thanks to cable reruns, never forgotten TV series, life must first be centered before moving on to the more defined and refined aspects of substance and form. So much for centering. Thanks to Daniel, she was about as far from dead center as a cross-eyed archer. I don't want to be his friend, she whined aloud as she let up on the foot pedal to stop the wheel. After dipping her hands in a bucket of cool water, she leaned back over the clay. She sent the wheel in motion again, set the bottom and then the top of the vase. Then she began to count through her slow, gradual upward pull. 1,000. He was coming over in less than an hour. 2,000. After Sunday Mass and dinner with his family. 3,000. He was going to show her how to defend herself. 4,000. Fudge, she muttered when she torqued her pull. The wall thinned due to her uneven pressure and the top collapsed into the bottom of the vase. Staring at the disaster, she let up on the wheel and slumped back in her chair, defeated. Lord help her, he wanted to teach her self-defense and she just didn't think that she had any defenses left. Phoebe answered the doorbell, wiping her hands on a grimy towel and wearing a white butcher's apron covered in what looked like mud. Whatever it was, Daniel realized that it was also smudged on her chin and her cheek and on the shoulder of a white t-shirt that had definitely seen better days. She'd even managed to smear some of it on the frame of her glasses. "You're early," she accused with a flustered scowl made all the more endearing by the flush that spread from her forehead downward to disappear beneath the round neck of her shirt. "Sorry. I guess I am." He checked his watch. "A little. Did I catch you? Just what the hell did I catch you doing?" he asked on a laugh, then couldn't resist teasing her. "Wait, I get it. It's mud pack time. Right?" She looked a little self-conscious, then shrugged. "Come on. I'll show you. You're a potter," he said, incredulous, as she led him down her basement steps and into a room lined with metal shelves and cluttered with equipment. Pottery in various stages, from recently thrown, to drying, to bisque-fired, to an array of beautifully finished pieces glazed in a rainbow of stunning colors, filled the basement studio. In the center of the room was her potter's wheel, off to one side, an electric kiln. On the other side of the room, an old stereo system took up an upper shelf, while a hodgepodge of tools and sponges, boxes of clay and things he didn't recognize and couldn't define filled the rest of the spaces. "Those pieces in your living room, you did them?" "Guilty. You're good." He walked over to a display shelf and admired a picture molded of elegant lines and fluid grace. "Really good. It's just a hobby and, trust me, I'm strictly an amateur," she insisted without a speck of false modesty. "But I'm getting better." He turned around and grinned at her. A woman of hidden talents. She avoided his eyes by fumbling around behind her to untie her apron, then slip it over her head. "A woman with mud under her fingernails," she said, giving them a passing glance. "And on your face." Before he stopped to think about it, he touched his thumb to her cheek, brushed lightly at the smear of dried clay. Her skin was very soft, and suddenly very hot beneath his touch. His gaze dropped to her mouth and he remembered another kind of heat. Another kind of softness that involved that mouth, wet and willing and sexy as hell. "Well," she said, stepping away, an effective reminder of the lines that he, himself, had drawn and of the places that were off-limits. "Look all you want. Just, let me jump in the shower quick and I'll be ready to learn some blood-curdling yell or something equally self-defensive or offensive or something." "Oh, wait," she stopped and turned back toward him, her eyebrows pinched together. "Is this going to involve sweating? Because if there's sweating involved, maybe, no sweating," he promised. "Go ahead and take your shower." She opened her mouth, shut it, then without another word turned and headed up the stairs. He stood there a long time, looking at her pottery and thinking about the shape of her tidy little butt packed into a pair of old, faded jeans as she'd walked away from him. It was, without question, a very fine butt. But it was attached to his very fine friend and he had no business thinking about it the way he'd been thinking about it, bare and filling his palms. Just as he had no business thinking about anything involving him and her and sweating. He dragged a hand over his face. "Look all you want," she'd said. To that, he added the qualifier, "but don't touch." So he touched her pottery instead. He could see something of her in every piece. Delicate yet enduring. Whimsical and elegant. Romantic. He let out a long breath, raked his hands through his hair and wondered just why the hell he was here messing with her life. And then he thought of Jason Collins and he knew exactly why. "Okay, let's do this," Daniel said as they faced off in a small room off her studio that was partially finished into what Phoebe liked to think of as her future den. So far, all she'd been able to afford was a cheap, tight-napped tweed carpet and drywall. The ceiling still wasn't finished. An old desk that housed her aging computer and a couple of folding chairs were the only pieces of furniture. "I want you to think about a few things before we get started on the actual physical techniques." Oh, Phoebe was thinking, all right, and some physical techniques came to mind that had nothing to do with self-defense. He stood before her in another one of his seemingly endless supply of black t-shirts that hugged his chest and broad shoulders, and a pair of those windbreaker-type jogging pants, and she thought about a lot of things. Not enough of them involved getting out of this lesson with her sanity intact. First off, you need to be aware. Got that covered, she thought dismally, way too aware of the way his biceps strained at the cotton of his shirt sleeves. Awareness of where you are, he continued, thankfully not aware of her wayward thoughts, and of what could happen is one of the most important self-defense mechanisms anyone, man or woman, can have in place. And never, ever, act or look like an easy target. But I am an easy target, she pointed out. Not anymore, you're not. You mean I've already passed some test and didn't even know it? She batted her lashes with staged brightness. I mean that starting today, things are going to be different. Phoebe, a woman can prepare against any number of threats by simply thinking about normal everyday items as potential weapons. If you're inside, for instance, chairs, ashtrays, bottles, even ordinary kitchen utensils can all be used as weapons. Okay, what? He asked with narrowed eyes as she battled a grin. Oh, I was just picturing a scenario that involved taking someone out with a wire whisk. Okay, she said hastily when he planted his hands on his hips and glared. It was just a thought. Outdoors, he continued, his voice and face stern, look for bricks, sand, sticks. Your car keys can gouge, your cell phone can be used as a club. Think about what's in your purse. A pen or a long-tailed comb can cause a lot of pain and give you that window you need to run away. Hairspray can temporarily blind. And then there's this. He dug into his pocket and pulled out a small canister about twice the size of a tube of lipstick. Pepper spray. Oh, you shouldn't have, she said demurely, accepting it like a cherished gift. He angled her another hard look. Are we going to get serious anytime soon? She rolled her eyes, wobbled her head. Okay, fine. We're serious. Look, I know what you're doing. You're trying to joke your way through this because it scares you. You can get past the fear, Phoebe, if you build a little confidence in the belief that you can take care of yourself. Properly chastised, effectively sobered, she nodded. Okay. I'm sorry. No more fooling around. It was hard, but she managed to make it through the next hour or so listening to him talk, watching him show her things that she wouldn't in a million years have equated to self-defense tactics. Most of them were basic and so painfully simple that she felt foolish for not having had a better awareness. All right, he said after they'd reviewed and discussed to his satisfaction. How are you feeling about all this now? Better. Really, she said with a thoughtful nod and realized that she meant it. Thanks. She did feel better, right up until the time he said, we'll save the next lesson for another time. What? Wait. Panic in the form of a herd of butterflies winged its way from her tummy to her throat in 0.005 seconds flat. What next lesson? How do you know all this stuff? She asked, afraid there was no end. I listen, I learn. I took classes, he said, somehow managing to, kindly, imply that everyone should. Okay, we're going to work on a kung fu move, Daniel said on Friday night as he stood before her in black gym shorts and, of course, another one of his black t-shirts. He was also barefoot. She'd never thought of a man's feet as sexy. But then, she'd never seen Daniel Barone's feet. She'd seen them a lot this week. And they were attached to such spectacular legs, tanned and toned. The way the muscles rippled beneath his skin and the way his baby-fine, silky soft hair lightly dusted that skin. Phoebe? Huh. She looked up and realized she'd spaced out on him again. Drawing a bracing breath, she tried to look interested in his lesson. I'm listening. If he noticed her little side trips into Lustland or any of the other mini vacations she'd taken this week, he didn't let on. All business, that was Daniel Barone. He showed up looking like eye candy that shot off the calorie charts and ran through his bulging repertoire of self-defense moves with the single-minded determination of a drill sergeant training a raw recruit. It was as hard on her ego as it was on her heart, this buddy business. This is a great technique against an attack from behind, he began. It was all she could do to keep from glaring at him. Did he feel nothing? Sense none of the heat that threatened to spike her temperature into the meltdown zone? Let's say you're waiting at a bus stop. Why would I be at a bus stop? She asked a little testily and used the opportunity to back a step away. Anything to put a little distance between her and the way he smelled, the heat of his body, the way he was going to touch her. Already there had been a lot of touching this past week. Just thinking about lesson number 1 put her poor little heart out of commission again. It's a for instance, okay? For the sake of illustration, just go with me here. Now, you're at a bus stop, he restated, setting up his scenario, maybe reading the newspaper while you wait. It's dark, you're alone and someone approaches you from behind. Okay, you play the attacker and we'll walk through this. He turned his back to her. Move in fast and grab my shoulder. Yeah. Like that. Phoebe closed her eyes and endured. My reaction is to drop the paper, turn and deliver a right palm strike directly into your face. He turned in slow motion, walking through the technique. See how I keep my arm straight? The idea is to hit him like a bullet. Again he demonstrated, shoving his hand toward her face at striking speed but pulling up short so he didn't make contact and hurt her. What happens next is that he'll double forward. Double forward, Phoebe, he instructed, and then I follow up with a knee strike to the chest. Again he demonstrated in slow motion. As she doubled over at the waist, he lifted his knee toward her chest, stopping just short of contact. See, that's going to throw him off balance, and when that happens, you move right on in and push him away. With steadying hands, he showed how her body would react. Then you finish him off with a front kick right in his breadbasket. Okay, he said, looking down at her. Do you think you've got it? Yes. Actually, it was kind of a blur. She'd say just about anything at this point to get all of this touching and looking and concentrating over with. I've got it. Okay. Now you try. She'd already known this was coming. There was a lot of rehearsing, she'd learned, in practicing self-defense moves. Which was why they called it practicing, Daniel had said with a tolerant grin after their Wednesday night session. It was with no small amount of frustration that she let out a bothered breath, turned her back and waited for his attack. He touched a hand to her shoulder. With a speed fueled by 3 days of frustration and the nervous dispatch of a gun with a hair trigger, she whirled around. She slammed the flat of her hand into his face, hiked her knee into his chest when he doubled over, shoved, then drove her foot into his diaphragm. He landed spread eagle on his back with an oomph. Then he just lay there. For the longest moment Phoebe stood looking down, waiting for him to get up. He didn't so much as move a pinky. Daniel? She asked carefully as she gave the bottom of his bare foot a cautious nudge with her toe. His chest started to heave. Oh my God. She dropped to her knees by his side. I hurt you. No, he said just as she realized he wasn't fighting for breath. He was laughing. Damn, Phoebe. His blue eyes danced as they met hers. When you finally decide to put your heart into it, you really make a statement. You mean I really laid you out? You weren't just acting? You got me good, girl. He sat up, propped his elbows on his knees and grinned at her. Congratulations. I think you just passed the course. She felt the blood drain from her head, felt her stomach roil at the knowledge that she, passive Phoebe Richards, had committed a violent act on another human being. Phoebe? His voice tightened in alarm. He grabbed her arms to steady her when her knees folded and she plopped down on the floor with a thud. I think I'm going to be sick. You okay now? Daniel asked a few minutes later. Embarrassed, Phoebe stood and, to make sure he understood that she really was okay, she brushed off her sweatpants and forced a smile. Fine. Thanks. I told you I was a weenie when it came to physical violence. You aren't a weenie. You just had a strong reaction when you realized that you actually have the ability to put a man on his back. I've put plenty of men on their backs, mister, she thought, suppressing the urge to glare. Well, not plenty. A few, though. Okay, 2. Counting him. And he didn't really count since she hadn't ended up on top of him. Where was the satisfaction in that? She wanted to know. At least she hadn't completely embarrassed herself and gotten sick, even though it had been touch and go for a while there. Daniel had shoved her head down between her knees, ordered her to breathe and hadn't let her stop until she'd turned from green back to pink again. "You know what?" he asked once he was satisfied that she really was okay. "I think this calls for a celebration." He checked his watch. "If we get moving, we can catch a movie. We could even grab a bite to eat and make it before the coming attractions if you're up for it." Phoebe was up for a lot of things. One of them wasn't torturing herself by sitting across from Daniel for another chat and chew session that could only end with her feeling frustrated and edgy and sexually supercharged by all the pheromones he emitted to the tune of about a bazillion per second. Another thing she wasn't up to facing was the prospect of sitting beside him in the dark intimacy of a movie theater, their arms accidentally brushing and their fingers tangling in a tub of buttered popcorn. 1,000 excuses winged through her mind. She had to do laundry, scrub her bathroom tile with a toothbrush, clean her refrigerator and send the mold she found there to the lab for analysis. Any one of them would ensure that she avoided both the dinner and the movie. Most of them were viable, all of them were wise. She opened her mouth to spout one, and to her utter amazement what came out instead was, "Okay. Great. I brought a change of clothes. Mind if I use your shower?" She couldn't manage a verbal response to that one. He was already on his feet and heading toward the basement stairs anyway. She was still sitting on the floor when she heard the shower go on upstairs. He was naked. And wet. And tonight, she was going to sleep wrapped in the towel he used to dry himself off. With a groan, she lowered her head to her knees again. And breathed. Chapter 7. Phoebe made it through dinner, but only because the restaurant had been packed and she'd taken the opportunity to avoid a potentially difficult one-on-one with Daniel by enthusiastically volunteering to share their table with a middle-aged couple from some obscure little town in Idaho. She now knew more about potatoes than she'd ever dreamed possible. She even made it through the movie, but only because she'd insisted they see a macho action-adventure flick with lots of sweating, grunting, flying bullets and random acts of violence. And blood. There had been lots of fake blood. Of course, Daniel had laughed a lot because she'd watched most of it between the index and middle finger of the hand that she'd slapped over her face. That was fine. She'd rather be squeamish over fake blood than steamy love scenes any day. And there'd been no popcorn. Not for her. Not even when he'd offered several times. She wasn't going to take a chance on any tangled, buttery fingers. It was with a huge relief that the ending credits rolled, the lights came up and it was time to leave. Now all she had to do was make it home, cuff him on the shoulder like a good old boy, would a belch be taking it too far, and escape inside her house. Alone. "So, you really enjoyed that, huh?" Daniel asked as they walked out of the theater lobby and into the sultry August night. "You bet." He laughed. "Do all librarians make lousy liars, or is it just you who's particularly inept?" She looked up into his warm blue eyes and fessed up. "I think maybe it's just me." He draped a companionable arm over her shoulders and gave her a little squeeze, pressing his body against hers from shoulder to thigh. He lowered his mouth to her ear. "Well, here's a tip," he whispered confidentially. "Don't ever cheat on your taxes. You'd never be able to lie your way out of an audit." She didn't hear anything past the word tip. A soft, low buzzing sounded in her head, drowned out the rest of his words as his breath stirred the fine hair above her ear and the long, hard length of his body jolted every erogenous zone to high alert status. What?" she heard herself mumble when she realized he'd stopped just outside the theater doors and had asked her a question. He grinned at her. "I said, do you want to go for ice cream?" "Ice cream? You know? Cold. Sweet. Sometimes comes with hot fudge," and he stopped mid-sentence as his eyes cut across the street. His expression turned hard as stone. "Son of a bitch," he swore and pulled her protectively to his side. Startled out of her mini stupor by his drastic shift of mood, Phoebe gathered her wits enough to follow his gaze. Her heart rate kicked up several beats when she saw what had drawn his attention. Jason Collins was parked across the street from the theater. He'd rolled down his window, making sure that he was seen and recognized. "The bastard is stalking you." In a slow motion that was frightening for its staged and precise casualness, Daniel's gaze shifted from his combative stare down with Jason to Phoebe's face. His features softened as he looked down at her, then touched his hand to her cheek. "Let's see if we can funnel some of his anger in another direction," he said, nudging her backward. Before she could assimilate what was happening, her back connected with the outer wall of the theater and Daniel connected with her front. "He wants to be ticked off at someone. Let's get him ticked off at me." "Hold on," he whispered as his mouth descended. "We're going to make this look good." "Look good?" she thought. "Make what look good?" Eyes wide and round, Phoebe opened her mouth to ask, but the words stalled in her throat. In the end, it didn't matter anyway. Just as it didn't matter that she'd lifted her hands and pressed them to his chest to do exactly what, she didn't know. Maybe she'd been about to suggest that he rethink this. Maybe she'd been going to tell him that this was a really, really bad idea. Maybe she'd been going to push him away. But then his mouth touched hers, covered hers, opened over hers. With the press of his body, he demanded that she do the same. Then nothing but his mouth mattered anymore. He kissed her, deeply, sweetly, and wrapped her so tightly against him it was hard to breathe, let alone think. Let alone protest. Let alone remember why she'd thought this was a bad idea in the first place. She blinked and watched his face, watched those thick dark lashes lower to brush his cheeks, and on a groan that married surrender to desire, she let her eyes drift shut and let him take control. His kiss. Oh, his kiss. It was everything she'd ever dreamed a kiss should be. Everything that Jason's kisses had never been. It was rough yet tender. It was intense and demanding. It was filled with passion and need. She lost herself in it and in him and totally forgot that it was all for show. She lifted her arms, wrapped them around his neck, and with a sigh that was part shock and all swift, instant arousal, let him nudge her legs apart with his knee. When his big hands skated down her back and settled over her bottom, then pressed her up and into his hips, she lifted up on tiptoe to encourage the contact, enhance the fit. He was so much as he slanted his mouth over hers, changed the angle and dived back for another long, lingering mating of their mouths that involved tangled tongues and sultry sighs. Someone whimpered, probably her, when he lifted his head. He heaved a deep breath and touched his forehead to hers. She swallowed, then dared to meet his eyes, slumberous and dark, full of wanting and wonder and desire. "Maybe," he said, his voice gruff, as he pressed her deeper into the brick wall at her back, "we ought to give him another demonstration. Just to make sure he gets the message." What exactly is the message?" Phoebe murmured, breathless and afraid to hope she'd read more into his kiss than a staged strategy to redirect Jason's anger toward Daniel and away from her. He answered her with a searching look, then lowered his mouth again. Kissed her again. It was a study in sensuality, all warm breath and thrusting tongue that set a rhythm to mirror the act of making love and turned her legs to jelly. Her heart hammered so hard she could hear every beat in her ears, feel every pulse point in those places where their bodies met and meshed and made promises of the things they could do and the way they would fit in the dark. The loud squeal of tires had Daniel lifting his head. She peeked over his shoulder. Together, they watched Jason's taillights disappear down the street in a screaming blur. "I think," Daniel said, his voice as rough as sandpaper, his breath as labored as hers, "that might have done the trick." Well, it had certainly done it for her. "You okay?" He slowly pulled away. She met his eyes, gauged the latent heat there and gave a jerky nod. Liar, liar, pants on fire. If he noticed the lie in her eyes, he decided to ignore it. "Come on. Let's get you home." On a shaky breath, Phoebe took the hand he offered and walked silently beside him to his car. So they'd just delivered a message. And she was still wondering exactly what that message was. Wondering, no hoping, that Daniel Barone had just gotten a message too. Maybe there was more here. maybe he could actually care about her a little. Maybe even care a lot. By the time they'd reached her house after a long, silent ride that did not include a stop for ice cream, reality had crashed her little party with a vengeance. Daniel Barone, male extraordinaire, was not going to fall for a dowdy, unsophisticated librarian, who, her saner side reminded her, was not only 3 years older than he was, but was light years away from the kind of woman who could really turn him on, reel him in and embark on the road leading to happily ever after. But, oh, she thought as she lay alone in her bed that night, could that man fake a kiss? Daniel stared at himself in the bathroom mirror the next morning. He looked like hell. He dragged a hand over his face. A sleepless night would do that to a man. Several sleepless nights, in fact. So would an ice cream eating, tortoiseshell toting, pottery making, mud packing, red toenail polish wearing liar of a librarian. He'd always thought of Phoebe as honest. But she'd been lying to him all week. With her eyes. With her tight little smiles. She'd been telling him that all the togetherness, all the touching that resulted from working through the self-defense moves hadn't affected her. That she wasn't as hot for him as he was for her. The little liar. He splashed cold water over his face, then braced both hands on the edge of the sink. He hung his head and finally admitted that he'd been lying too. To himself and to her. This could not continue. He could not continue to mosey over to her house, pretend he wanted to be her buddy and then fabricate reasons to touch her, excuses to kiss her. Not when she felt like liquid fire in his arms. Not when her mouth opened so sweetly, so greedily beneath his. Not when she looked at him with those baby owl eyes that begged him to take her to bed. Which was exactly where he wanted her. So hotshot, now what? He asked his reflection. The phone rang. He considered letting his machine pick up, but in the end he walked into his bedroom and answered. Barone, he said on a gruff bark. Daniel? Ash? Is that you? Not if your mood is as foul as it sounds. Hell. I'm sorry. You caught me, preoccupied, he said, amazed at the magnitude of his understatement. Where are you? In Boston. No joke? I would not joke about something like that, Daniel. Daniel smiled. No. Sheikh Ashraf Salem, the Prince of Zamr, would not joke about something like that. They'd met several years ago at the Soldeu ski resort in Andorra in the Pyrenees. Ash had been on vacation. Daniel had just dropped by on the way to somewhere else, and Andorra had been a convenient stopover. He'd hit it off with the independent financial consultant immediately. He and Ash had not only forged a friendship over snifters of cognac in the lounge, it had been the beginning of a successful business relationship. After running a check to make sure that Ash was who he'd said he was and that he was damn successful at what he did, Daniel had turned over a small portion of the inheritance he'd received from his grandfather. Ash had parlayed it into a tidy profit. Over the past 5 years, Daniel had gradually turned his entire portfolio over to Ash to handle. So what brings you to the States? A little of this. A little of that. Business for the most part. And it's been some time since we've met, my friend. Too damn long, Daniel agreed. Are you free anytime this week? Name the time and the place and I'll be there. Tomorrow then. Lunch? After they decided on specifics, Ash rung off. Daniel thought about his friend on and off all day. At least he did when he wasn't thinking about Phoebe. How had he let things get so out of hand with her? How had he convinced himself that she hadn't been looking at him with hunger in her eyes and a need that matched his growing need for her? And why hadn't he recognized that every time he saw her, he was doing the equivalent of crawling into the engine of a freight train called danger and heading straight toward a cliff? Would it be so terrible, he rationalized under the shower spray the next morning as he got ready to meet Ash. Would it really be so terrible to indulge in a physical relationship with Phoebe? It wasn't as if she wasn't an adult. It wasn't as if she wouldn't understand going in that while what they could have together would be very special, it couldn't be a relationship in the traditional sense of the word. Not a lasting relationship at any rate. Couldn't they both just enjoy it while it lasted? He knew he could and would enjoy it to the fullest. until it was time to walk away. He twisted off the faucets. It was at the walking away part that things got sticky. He could do it. No problem. Would he miss her? Absolutely. She was sweet and funny and sexy and kind. And gentle. And there were times when he looked into her eyes that he found himself wanting to look into them forever. Snagging a towel, he dragged it over his hair, then rubbed himself down. Forever. Now there was a word. He tossed the towel on the bed and strode to the bureau. He pulled out clean boxers and stepped into them, then sat on the edge of the bed to drag on his socks. Forever. It all boiled down to that word. She deserved it and he couldn't give it to her. If he started something they both wanted, it would hurt her when he walked away. And that led him back to square one. He could not have an affair with her, no matter how hot, how steamy, how off the charts incredible it would be. But how could he just walk away from her? How could he leave her at the mercy of Jason Collins? He was still turning the thought over in his mind when he met Ash at the Ritz. As he watched the sheikh walk toward their table, turning every female head in the place, an idea started taking shape. The last time he'd spoken with Ash, his friend had confided that he was in a settling down mood. He wanted everything that Daniel didn't. He wanted to get married. He wanted a family. He wanted a woman to look at him as if he was the most important thing in her world. Phoebe looked at Daniel that way. It made his heart hurt to see that look in her eyes. Mainly because it was directed at the wrong man. All through lunch, as he and Ash caught up, talked a little business, slung a little bull, an idea floated around in the back of his mind. He couldn't turn it off, and by the time lunch was over, he'd decided what he had to do. He wasn't the right man for Phoebe, but maybe Ash was. He was darkly handsome, charismatic, loaded, and he wanted a wife. Plus, Ash would meet every one of Phoebe's romantic fantasies. So, he said, crossing an ankle over his knee, "There's this party Wednesday night at my parents' brownstone." He filled Ash in on the sudden appearance of his long-lost cousin, Karen Rollins, and the fact that it was a welcome to the family party in her honor. "Why don't you come? You know my parents and brother and sisters, but I'd really like for you to meet the rest of the family. And I have this friend I'd like you to meet." Ash lifted an eyebrow. "Friend?" Daniel found that he had a bit of difficulty forcing a smile. "Phoebe," he said, and now that the die was cast, he felt a hollow ache spread through his chest. "Phoebe Richards. She'll be there. He'd make sure she'd be there. You'll like her. You'll like her a lot." And then he proceeded to tell him about Phoebe. About her smile and her quirky sense of humor. About her inability to recognize and accept how beautiful she was. How she was the perfect match for a man with marriage on his mind. How her eyes shined when something tickled her. How she had the ability to listen, really listen, and not make a man feel like a fool for unloading like a dump truck. Ash's contemplative silence seemed to tell the tale. He was interested. And that was great. That was just great, Daniel thought with a dark scowl as he dialed Phoebe's number the next day. After their little play date, on Friday night, Phoebe had spent a miserable weekend waiting by the phone for Daniel to call. She'd known it was foolish, hopeless even, but she'd done it just the same. Some lessons took a long time to learn. She'd moped and moaned and taken out her frustration on a lot of hapless lumps of clay. There weren't enough flowers in Boston to fill the vases she'd thrown. She knew that Leslie had noticed her dark mood at work on Monday, but she hadn't asked, recognizing that if Phoebe wanted to talk about it, she would. By the time her phone rang Monday night, she'd given up on the possibility of Daniel Barone being on the other end. "Goes to show how much I know," she murmured, pleased yet puzzled and a little bit panicked after Daniel said goodbye. After she snapped out of her shock-induced mini-stroke, she dialed her friend Carol. "Help," she squeaked when Carol picked up. "Phoebe?" "Cinderella actually," Phoebe said a little breathlessly. "And I just got invited to the ball." "Gee," Carol said after Phoebe filled her in on the fact that Daniel had just invited her to attend a family party in honor of his new cousin. "And me without my pumpkin. I don't need a pumpkin. I need something to wear." Somebody pinch me, Phoebe thought as she stood at Daniel's side Wednesday night in the large, crowded living room of his parents' home. She was drifting on a haze of disbelief that she was here as Daniel's date, meeting his family. How had the fat, shy, ugly duckling 12-year-old girl who'd grown up in the seedy side of Boston ended up rubbing elbows with Boston royalty? She wasn't exactly fat anymore, but she still battled her weight, and even if she dropped the 10 pounds she was always struggling to lose, thin was not a word that would ever be used to describe her. She was still painfully shy when she was out of her element, as she was tonight. And she was as far from a princess as she'd been at 12, in looks or bearing. Princesses generally wore white and diamonds and diaphanous smiles. Still, she was more than glad she'd listened to Carol's advice and opted for the basic black sheath. She'd found the dress in a frantic search through the racks at Elegant Repeats, a dress shop where the upscale Boston elite sent their once-worn clothing to dye with dignity so they could make room in their closets for more designer originals that they would wear once and then start the cycle all over again. New, the sleeveless crepe that hit her just above the knee would have cost the better part of her weekly paycheck. Even delicately worn, as the tag had indicated, it had made a major dent in her budget. It had been worth every penny. At least on the surface, she appeared to fit in, as all around her the room was full to bursting with the famous and elegantly dressed Baronne clan. All of them were beautiful and completely comfortable in their element. All, perhaps, except Karen Rollins, the guest of honor. Oh, she was definitely beautiful. But comfortable? Phoebe didn't think so. Daniel had introduced her to Karen shortly after they'd arrived. Phoebe had felt a tug of empathy for the pretty woman with the wide hazel eyes and wavy brown hair. She looked a little overwhelmed. She was glad to see that Karen and Daniel's cousin Maria had hit it off so well. She'd even overheard Maria offer Karen the use of her old apartment and a job at the Baronessa Gelateria. Yes, the Barones were a boisterous lot, but Maria had proven that they were also warm and friendly, if unintentionally intimidating for their confidence and close camaraderie. At least they all seemed close, with the exception of Daniel's twin brother, Derek, who, to Daniel's mother's disappointment, hadn't made an appearance. At one time or another, Daniel had mentioned with affection both his sister Emily, whom she'd met a few minutes ago, and his sister Claudia, whom she hadn't yet met. When his brother's name came up, however, she'd sensed a lot of tension. Derek was a topic that Daniel steered clear of. Tonight, however, Derek seemed to be at the top of everyone else's list of topics. Phoebe hadn't intended to eavesdrop, but in such close quarters it was impossible not to hear snippets of conversation. There was a lot of speculation on why Derek hadn't shown up and about his behavior lately. It seemed he'd become more and more withdrawn and aloof. She looked at the man at her side while a knot of Barones clustered around them, talking about children and business and fun. She'd been trying to ignore it, but Daniel seemed a little withdrawn and aloof tonight himself. He just wasn't quite Daniel. He was quieter than usual, almost as if he was trying to erect a bit of distance between them. "Did you say curse?" she asked abruptly, tuning in to something Daniel's cousin Nicholas had said. Even though they were cousins, not brothers, Daniel was a younger, mirror image of Nicholas. "You mean Daniel hasn't told you about the dreaded Valentine's curse?" Gail Barone, Nicholas's wife, asked with grin and a staged shiver of dread. Phoebe had liked Gail Barone instantly when they'd been introduced. She was down to earth and friendly, her hazel eyes full of fun as she smiled from her husband to Phoebe. "Now Gail. You know it's not nice to joke about the curse," Nicholas said with a playful frown as he wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "What curse?" Phoebe asked, really curious now. "It's nothing. Just an old family legend," Daniel said, shaking his head at his cousin who was urging him to flesh out the story. "That goes something like," Gail prompted Daniel as she wrapped her arm around Nicholas's waist and snuggled closer. Dutifully picking up his cue, Daniel explained, "When our grandfather Marco was a young man, he waited tables at Antonio Conti's restaurant down on Prince Street. Apparently Antonio had always hoped that Marco would marry their daughter, Lucia. But it didn't quite work out that way, Nicholas supplied. Gail picked up the story from there. Instead of marrying Lucia, Marco fell in love with Angelica Salvo, who was the ice cream maker at the restaurant and who just happened to be the girlfriend of the Conti's son, Vincent. "Uh-oh," Phoebe said. "I think I see where this is going." Long story short, Daniel put in, Marco and Angelica eloped. On Valentine's Day, Gail prompted. On Valentine's Day, Daniel restated with a nod to Gail. It broke Lucia's heart, and Vincent, who had looked upon Marco as a brother, felt betrayed. The entire Conti family felt betrayed, added Nicholas. And Lucia, in her anger, placed a curse on Marco and Angelica. Gail, you want to take it from here? Let's see if I remember it right. You got married on Valentine's Day and may your anniversary day be cursed. A miserable Valentine's Day to both of you from this day forward. Did I get it right? Perfect, darling. Nicholas kissed her when she lifted her face to his. And so, did anything bad happen to your grandfather and grandmother? Phoebe asked, both unsettled and charmed by the story. The two cousins exchanged a look. Daniel shrugged. Well, they established Baronessa Gelati. I wouldn't exactly call that bad. But Angelina miscarried her first child on their first anniversary, and for that reason, they began to take the curse seriously, Nicholas explained. A number of minor things happened after that, nothing disastrous, until Daniel's father was born. Oh dear, Phoebe said, suspecting she already knew the answer to her question. Your father's twin brother, Luke. Was he abducted on Valentine's Day? Yes. How sad. What's even sadder is that there's been a rift between the Conti and the Barons ever since. All because of that silly curse. What happened to Lucia and to Vincent? Nicholas filled in that blank. Vincent eventually married and took over the Conti restaurant. Lucia never married. I can't remember who told me this, but they said that the last time they saw her, she looked like a bitter old crone. I'm so sorry to interrupt this, Gail said, smiling apologetically, but I just spotted someone I must say hello to. Excuse us, will you, Daniel? Phoebe, it was so nice meeting you. Daniel will have to bring you for dinner sometime so we can get to know each other better. I'd like that, Phoebe said with a smile that faded when an unsmiling Daniel stiffened beside her. You're out of champagne, he said. Let me see if I can find another glass for you. Well, Phoebe thought as she watched him go. Okay. So he was uncomfortable with the idea of thinking past tonight. Maybe he was having second thoughts about bringing her home to meet his family. And maybe she had been a little quick on the trigger when she'd thought she was here as anything other than Daniel's buddy. But surely being here meant something, didn't it? Surely it said something? Like maybe he wasn't content for them to just be friends any longer? She wanted so much to believe that as she watched him work his way back to her, carrying 2 flutes of champagne. He looked incredibly handsome in black tie and tux. Sorry I took so long. He relieved her of her empty glass, set it on the mantel behind her and placed the fresh glass in her hand. There's someone I want you to meet. Phoebe, this is Sheikh Ashraf Salem, Prince of Zamr. Ash, this is the friend I told you about, Phoebe Richards. Phoebe looked up and into a face right out of the Arabian Nights. Sheikh Ashraf Salem was one of the most exotically handsome men she'd ever seen. His eyes were so brown they were almost as black as his hair, his smile was warm and interested. He was taller than Daniel's 5'11" frame, but not by much, and even in his formal attire, it was apparent that every inch of his body was sleekly muscled and sinfully elegant. Ms. Richards, the prince said, and taking her hand in his, brought her fingers to his mouth. It is my extreme pleasure to meet you. The pleasure is mine, she assured him, proud as heck that she'd managed the response without a single ah or duh. Her speech impairment seemed to be limited to her response to Daniel. Well, I'll just let you two get to know each other, Daniel said with a tight smile. Then he turned and walked away. Phoebe blinked, opened her mouth to stop him, and realized she didn't know what to say. With a sickening roll of her stomach, she did, however, realize what had just happened. Daniel had arranged for her to be alone with the sheikh. The implication was obvious. He was setting them up. Her face flamed red. Embarrassed, she lowered her gaze to the floor and held it there. Anything to keep from watching Daniel leave. Anything to keep the sheikh from seeing the bewilderment and hurt that must be painted across her face like a banner. Oh, how rich. Daniel hadn't brought her here to meet his family. He'd never intended that she think she was his date. He'd brought her here to set her up with his friend. Because, after all, she thought bitterly as hurt transitioned to humiliation, she was nothing more to Daniel than a buddy. The sudden pain of that undeniable truth clenched tightly in her chest and twisted. She had to get out of here. She had to get out of here now. Chapter 8. Phoebe? Ms. Richards? Phoebe heard Ashraf's voice through a haze of painful longing that quickly transitioned to anger, at herself as much as at Daniel. The anger finally drew out her pride. Are you all right? The sheikh asked, touching a hand to her arm. Drawing a bracing breath, she lifted her head, smiled her brightest smile. I'm fine. I'm simply overwhelmed by the idea that I'm actually standing here talking to a real live prince. How do I address you? Just Ash, please, he insisted. And I assure you, it is I who am overwhelmed. Daniel told me you were beautiful, but his description did not do you justice. She was not beautiful. She had never been beautiful. And she didn't need a psychology degree to know that Ashraf Salem knew how to spread honey as thick as the asphalt in a parking lot. Or that she had just been dumped on a date that was never really a date. You're very kind, she said with a forced smile. And you are very much in love with my friend Daniel. If he'd whipped out a magic carpet then sailed it across the room, he couldn't have shocked her more. So it showed that much. Phoebe sighed, too defeated to deny it, even though she was still fighting it for all she was worth. And he is very much in love with you as well, I think. Phoebe pushed out a humorless laugh. I'm afraid you're mistaken. Daniel couldn't have made it any clearer. We're friends, he and I, that's the way he wants it. Ash smiled kindly. That may be the way he wants it, but I know my friend. That is not the way it is. He is very taken with you, Phoebe. He simply hasn't figured out yet that he's fighting a losing battle as he tries to deny his feelings. She was still digesting that unlikely bit of wisdom when a tall, lovely blonde sidled up beside them and looped her arm through his. Ash, you handsome devil. What are you doing to this woman that's making my poor brother clench his jaw and glare as if he'd like to cheerfully choke the life out of you? She kissed him on the cheek before he could respond, then turned a brilliant smile on Phoebe. I'm Claudia, Daniel's sister. And you would be the first woman he's ever brought home and the only woman I've ever seen him look at like he wants to drag you away by your hair and have his way with you. How absolutely fascinating. Claudia, Ash addressed Daniel's sister with an amused smile. This is Phoebe Richards. Daniel just tried to set the two of us up. Claudia's smile widened, her eyes dancing with speculation. Better and better, she said, clearly intrigued by her brother's behavior. This could be serious. Ash, darling, be a dear and go away. Ms. Richards and I have to have a serious talk. Phoebe watched, speechless, as the sheikh smiled. I'm going, but not before I give Daniel a little something to think about. To her utter amazement, he leaned forward and kissed her, lingeringly, on the mouth. Oh, now you've done it, Claudia said, her voice bubbling with mirth. I don't believe I've ever seen Daniel's face that shade of red. And, present company excluded, I don't believe I've ever seen such a beautiful woman. The sheikh's gaze was locked on someone behind Phoebe's field of vision. Who is she? Claudia followed his gaze. That's Karen. Our guest of honor. Still reeling over Ashraf's kiss and his conclusions about Daniel, Phoebe listened with half an ear as Claudia related Karen's story. We're so glad to have her as part of the family, Claudia added. And yes, she is beautiful. The sheikh had evidently tuned out too. He was already cutting a path across the room where an impromptu receiving line had formed. Barones were lined up to give and receive hugs and kiss their newfound family member on the cheek. Ash, however, didn't believe in such casual expressions of welcome. Claudia and Phoebe laughed when he cut the line and grasped Karen's shoulders in his broad hands and drew her toward him. No bus on the cheek or air kisses for this man. He whispered something that surprised a shocked smile out of Karen, then he covered her mouth with his. "I love a man who knows what he wants and goes after it," Claudia said before turning her attention back to Phoebe. "Which brings us back to the subject of my brother, a supposedly smart man who obviously doesn't know what he wants or, for that matter, how to get it." Phoebe sat in the passenger seat of Daniel's Porsche as he drove her home from the party an hour or so later. He didn't have much to say. Neither did she. That was understandable to her way of thinking since she'd gone from glowing to grief-stricken to amazed all in one brief night. First she was Daniel's date, then she wasn't. Then she was the Sheikh's date, then she wasn't. And finally, she was the answer to a sister's prayer that her brother, who has an old soul, Claudia had confided with a sad shake of her head, had finally found the woman. Not a woman. The woman. Phoebe glanced across the dark interior at Daniel's perfect profile as he steered the sleek car across town. Could it be possible? Could she really be the woman for Daniel Barone? And if so, did she have what it took to, as Claudia had suggested, bring him to his senses, girl? And the best way to do that is to bring him to his knees. Had been her articulate response as yet another Barone had reduced her to monosyllabic mumblings. To his knees, Claudia had repeated, then smiled and spelled it out for her. Seduce him, Phoebe. He's got too much honor to seduce you. If I know Daniel, he's got it in his head that he can't love you and leave you. He just doesn't know yet that he's not leaving. Not this time. Do you see what I'm telling you here? Well, no, she didn't see. It was all so out there, way on the other side of the realm of possibility. She couldn't wrap her mind around the idea, let alone process it. Daniel has always been the golden boy, Claudia had continued, reacting to Phoebe's puzzled frown. He was the smart twin. The handsome twin, the athletic twin. Men admire him and want to emulate him, women and dogs adore him. Life for Daniel has always been easy. Do you know what kind of pressure that puts on a man? To always be expected to be the best, do the best? And to know that his brother has lived all of his life in Daniel's shadow? Fascinated, Phoebe had simply listened to Claudia talk with love and concern about Daniel. He once confided in me that he wished it had been Derek who'd gotten the looks and the easy intelligence that had allowed him to breeze through everything. He feels guilty over the fact that everything has been a stroll for him and a struggle for Derek. I think that's why he cut out of here after college. He'd never admit it, but I think he has this misaligned notion that if he disappointed Mom and Dad, maybe Derek would have his moment. And then maybe he and Derek would grow closer. It's always hurt him, the animosity Derek feels for him. Phoebe had been stunned, heartsick, at Claudia's revelations. And she felt selfish and immature suddenly for not seeing that Daniel of the quick smile and kind eyes had his own ghosts that haunted him. Her ghosts may be a bit more visible, Jason for one, her abusive, alcoholic mother for another, but Daniel's were every bit as intrusive on his life. I know my brother. And I know that he's crazy about you, Claudia had insisted, then added with a laugh, help him. For heaven's sake, help that poor bumbling fool. Phoebe was honestly starting to believe there might be something to what Claudia said. But was she woman enough? She asked herself as they turned onto her street. Did she have it in her to seduce him, as Claudia suggested? Or was she too much a coward to go after the man of her dreams for his sake, not hers? If it was just for her, she didn't think she could do it. But for Daniel, she decided she could do anything. She could be strong for him. She could be brave for him. He didn't need a coward in his life. He needed strength. He needed her strength, and if ever there was a time for her to test it, it was now. She drew a deep breath, let it out. Then she made him a solemn promise. "You're going down, buddy. To your knees. And I'm just the woman to get the job done." "What the hell?" Daniel leaned forward, squinting through the windshield as he approached her house. Phoebe followed his gaze, then gasped. A police cruiser sat in her driveway. Another was parked at the curb. Lights flashed everywhere. "Arthur," she cried when Daniel pulled up behind the cruiser and she realized her front door was wide open. "Please let Arthur be all right. Stay here." Daniel opened his door. Phoebe was already out of the car and running up her sidewalk. With a muttered oath, Daniel caught up with her, wrapped his arm around her waist and pulled her back against him. "You folks have business here?" A uniformed officer blocked them from entering the house. "I live here," Phoebe wailed. "Arthur. I have to find Arthur." "Her cat," Daniel explained. "Big Tabby? Oh God. Is he all right?" "He's fine. Last I saw him, he was scooting under a bed." Phoebe almost collapsed with relief. "What's going on?" Daniel asked, keeping Phoebe snug against his side. "We're not sure yet. Got a call from a neighbor. Said she saw someone sneaking around, looking suspicious. We just did a walk-through. There's no one here now. Ma'am, do you suppose you could come in, take a look for us and tell us if anything's missing?" "There won't be anything missing," Daniel said in a hard voice. The son of a bitch just wanted to scare her. The officer lifted an eyebrow. "You know who did this?" "Oh yeah." Daniel's voice was as tight as the lines bracketing his mouth. "His name is Jason Collins and she wants to file a restraining order against him." It was over an hour and a half later that the police finally left, without the restraining order. Hugging Arthur to her breast, Phoebe closed the door behind them, then leaned her forehead against it. "Do you think they'll turn up anything?" she asked, looking and sounding exhausted. "Honestly? No. He covered his tracks on that count. There weren't any prints. And you won't find anything missing. He did his damage by letting you know he could get to you anytime he wanted to." Daniel stood with his tie undone, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. He didn't trust himself to touch her right now. He had so much rage inside him for Collins and so much frustration over the limitations of the law that he was afraid some of it would spill over and he would bruise her by simply holding her. He understood why she couldn't file a restraining order against Collins. There was no proof that it was he who had broken in. Add that to the fact that Phoebe hadn't filed police reports the other times he'd harassed her or the time he'd hit her, and there was no legal basis for the order. So yeah, intellectually, he understood. It didn't, however, do much to assuage his anger. "Come on," he said. "You're staying at my place tonight." She looked up, seemed to consider complying, then something came over her that he'd never seen before. Anger. Defiance. And she slowly shook her head. "No," she said, a determination made strong by conviction. "I'm done. I'm not letting him call the shots for me anymore. He's not going to run me out of my own home. I'm not going to let him do it." Daniel looked at the face that so fascinated him. Her lush lips were unyielding. Though the smudges of violet beneath her eyes showed her fatigue and her stress, her eyes were clear and dry. Her shoulders were back, her head erect. Before his eyes, his little owl transformed into an eagle. He felt more than pride at her warrior stance. He was so turned on by it, it hurt to draw breath. "Then I'll sleep on your sofa," he said, battling to keep a rein on his libido, "because there's no way in hell I'm going to let you stay here alone." All business, he tossed his tuxedo jacket aside, sat down on the couch and toed off his shoes. "If you've got an extra blanket, I'm good to go." He'd just removed his socks when her continued silence brought his head up. He narrowed his eyes as she set Arthur on a side chair, then advanced toward him, one steady step at a time. "You are not sleeping on the sofa. But you are sleeping here. With me." There was no mistaking her intentions. The huskiness of her voice and the invitation in her eyes made it very clear. He forced himself to stand, gathered himself to be the voice of reason. But then she moved directly in front of him, filling his field of vision with amber eyes flecked in gold. Filling his senses with an awareness of her woman's scent, of every breath she drew, of the pale skin visible above the scooped neckline of her dress, of the gentle round of her breasts that pressed against the black crepe. He swallowed, shook his head and strove for restraint while his heart damn near hammered out of his chest at the thought of her naked and warm and willing beneath him. No. The word came out on a strangled croak. This can't happen. It shouldn't happen. And he was the one who needed to make sure it didn't. Look, Phoebe, you're running on adrenaline. It's doing your talking and your thinking at the moment. She moved so close that the warmth of her breath fluttered against his jaw, so close that the giving softness of her breasts pressed against his chest and made him groan. My adrenaline's talking, huh? He swallowed thickly. He nodded, when the power of speech took a hike to Brazil, where he ought to be. Tell me, she whispered, placing her hands on his chest, fingers splayed wide. The heat of her palms burned through his shirt. What, exactly, is it saying? Phoebe. Rock hard and trying his damnedest to resist her, he shackled her wrists with his hands. Don't, shush, she whispered against his throat, then slid her nose in a sensual caress along his jaw. The butterfly kiss of her lashes fluttered against the corner of his mouth. Listen. Listen to what it's saying. Oh, he was listening. He couldn't hear, of course. The teaspoon of blood that wasn't pooled in his groin had shot to his ears where it pounded like a battalion of kettle drums. He didn't have to hear what she said, though, to get her message loud and clear. She wanted what he wanted. And he wanted it bad. He'd never considered himself a weak man. But with her pressed up against him that way, her lips parted, her warm breath feathering his jaw, he felt about as strong as Samson after Delilah had gone crazy with her shears. So much for steely resolve. He didn't even bother to fake another argument. Tell me you're not going to regret this, he demanded, releasing her wrists and wrapping her in his arms. Just a sec. The little tease had the nerve to gloat over her victory. I'll need to consult with my adrenaline. Sliding her hands up his chest, then along his throat, she cupped his jaw and brought his mouth to within a breath of hers. Good news. Me and my glands are up for it. He exhaled on a serrated breath. Glad to hear someone's glands are in good working order. She smiled then. And so did he. You are turning me inside out here, he growled against her mouth. I don't want you inside out. One slim, questing hand journeyed down his chest, past his belt and lower, to cup and caress the length of the ridged flesh pressing against his zipper. I just want you inside. Of me. Well, he muttered, scooping her up in his arms. Now you're in trouble. She linked her arms behind his neck and ran the tip of her tongue along the outer edge of his ear. About time. Keep it up, just keep it up, and this is not going to happen with the benefit of a bed. Tiny teeth latched onto his earlobe, tugged. And that's bad because? That's bad, he managed to say on an involuntary shudder, because once I get you naked, I'm going to keep you that way for a very long time. And you're going to want a mattress, not a wall against your back. The implication of that threat finally stopped her busy mouth and wandering hands. Oh, she said, a sudden bout of uncertainty arresting her. Yeah. Oh. It was too late for second thoughts. He was so hot for her, nothing short of an unqualified, I changed my mind, was going to stop him now. He'd never seen her bedroom before. He didn't see much of it now. All he saw was her. All he wanted was her. It seemed as if he'd wanted her forever. He set her on her feet by the bed and reached for the switch on the bedside lamp. You, want the light on? I want the light on. Easing down on the edge of the bed, he took her hand, recognizing that she was suddenly feeling shy again. He tugged until she stood between his splayed legs. I want to see you. I've been going crazy wanting to see you. Even when you tried to pass me off to Ash? He slid his hands in a slow, exploring caress from her hips past her waist and then up the length of her back. His fingers found the zipper tab and tugged it slowly down. Especially when I tried to pass you off to Ash. I wanted to drop-kick him across the room when he kissed you." The zipper slid almost soundlessly past the small of her back, then stopped where the sweet cheeks of her bottom met. He pressed his face against her stomach, felt her heat through the black crepe, felt the slight tremble of her muscles against his lips. He lifted his hands to her shoulders. What if you're disappointed in what you see?" He tipped his head back, looked up at her. "Do you have a long furry tail?" One corner of her mouth tipped up. "No. Do you have fish scales on your bottom?" A generous smile this time. "Not the last time I looked." "Then I won't be disappointed." Another beautifully sensual shiver eddied through her body as he hooked his fingers over the neckline of her dress and pulled it slowly down. Soft crepe rustled against satin skin and pooled on the floor at her feet. A softer sigh soughed through her parted lips. He looked up, past the generous swell of her breasts that practically spilled over the top of black lace cups. She closed her eyes when his blunt-tipped fingers found the clasp between them, flicked it open. Her breasts sprang free. Warm, giving, much fuller than he'd imagined, heavy with arousal. Her nipples puckered into tight little beads as he cupped her, lifted, then scraped the edge of his thumbnails across dusty pink areolas that were so delicate and so utterly female he could have wept. Beautiful. Another shiver. Another breathy sigh. And he was lost. He tumbled her to her back on the bed and propped up on an elbow, to look and touch his fill. "So pretty," he whispered and lowered his head to taste one pale, quivering mound. He flicked his tongue over the crown of her nipple. She arched up to meet him, whimpered when he withdrew, making him smile into her slumberous eyes as he went back for more. Taking more this time than a glancing thrust of his tongue, he cupped her breast with his hand, drew her inside his mouth and feasted. She seemed to be having trouble breathing. And figuring out what to do with her hands. Her stiff fingers plucked at the spread beside her hips, then rose to tangle in his hair and press his mouth closer against her. She said his name on a desperate moan when he skimmed a hand down her tummy and cupped the heat still covered in damp black silk. "Tell me what you want." He lifted his head, then dipped to nuzzle her other breast. "You. Inside me. Now." He managed a strangled laugh. "You're really going to have to learn to express yourself. And you're really going to have to learn not to tease a desperate woman." Surprising him, she reared up. Pushing him to his back, she swung a leg over his hips and straddled him all in one fast, fierce and amazingly coordinated motion. Triumphant in her conquest, she smiled down at him. "Not so funny now, huh?" Well, yeah, it was. Funny and wonderful and sexy as hell. He couldn't help it. He laughed again when she went to work on the buttons of his shirt, then wrenched it off his shoulders and dragged it down his arms. She was a wild, erotic dream bent over him. Her lips were swollen from his kisses, her breasts wet and free and pink where the stubble on his jaw had abraded her tender flesh. And she was all woman as she rose to stand on her knees, her fingers flying to unbuckle his belt, unfasten his pants and, whoa. He stilled her hands before she did some real damage. "Easy. We'll both be happier if you take it easy." Her gaze locked on his, she drew a shaky breath, steadied herself. "You do it." Her hands turned in his, covered them then guided them to his zipper. "Hurry." The urgency of her whispered command damn near sent him over the edge. So did the way she looked, her knees pressed into the mattress on either side of his thighs, her bare breasts rising and falling with each fractured breath, her lower lip caught, in anticipation, between her teeth. He watched her face as he slowly lowered the zipper, lifted his hips and shoved his slacks and boxers to his knees. Her eyes grew dark with desire as her gaze rose to his, then back to the rock-hard length of his erection. And suddenly he didn't feel like playing anymore. "Touch me." Chapter 9. It felt as if she was having an out-of-body experience, Phoebe thought dreamily. Only she didn't want to be out of her body. For one of the few times in her life, she wanted to be in it. She wanted him to be in it. The look on his face told her he wanted that too, that he didn't care if she was far from perfect. He didn't care if her hips were a little too wide, if her breasts were a little too heavy and had never been described as perky. He thought she was beautiful. What she was looking at was beautiful too. She sank back on her heels so she could see him better. The hard muscle of his thighs pressed against her bottom, the heat in his eyes sent liquid fire pooling in that part of her that so wanted to be part of him. That such a man, such an intelligent, interesting and incredibly sexy man, could be this aroused by her seemed like a miracle. He was the miracle. He was so, everything. Everything that a bookish, 30-something librarian with the backbone of a snail had never thought, never dreamed, could be hers. Even if it was just for a night. He talked about her adrenaline, but it was really his that had brought them to this point. Tomorrow, it would be important to remember that he was reacting to his anger at Jason and his concern for her. Tonight, she didn't care what had landed him in her bed. What she cared about was his need. It made her strong, made her brave. It made her want him in ways that would embarrass her in the morning. But not tonight. Tonight, she was a siren, wanton and uninhibited. Tonight, she was a temptress. Tonight, she was in his arms, and she was driving him crazy. She slid her hands in a slow glide along his upper thighs, past his hip points, lingered over the concave of his belly, the delicious indentation of his navel. Oh, she knew where he wanted her to touch him, but she played it out, glancing her fingers over his taut nipples until he groaned, teasing her fingers through a mat of dark curls that so beautifully covered his chest. Power. It was a heady thing, this power she wielded. She could feel the stunning effects of it in the beat of his heart, fast and unsteady in his chest, see the heavy pulse of it thrumming through the thick artery at the base of his throat. She lifted her gaze to his. He was watching her. His blue eyes were as dark as cobalt, dangerous even, as his broad chest rose and fell in shallow breaths that appeared to take all of his control to keep level. He wet his lips, closed his eyes. Please. It shouldn't have been love that washed through her in a wave so strong it made her tremble. It shouldn't have been love that was born of his one tortured and desperate whisper. But it was. It most definitely was. Please. Tears burned then blurred her vision. She'd been half in love with him since the first night she'd seen him. Her knight in shining armor. Her slayer of dragons. That this strong man would let himself be weak for her, that he would let himself beg for her broke down her last defense and sent her tumbling. Headlong. Happily. Into a love she'd been fighting since the first time she'd seen him. Tomorrow, she would see the foolishness of it all. But tonight, oh, how she loved him tonight. Eyes locked on his, she trailed her hands downward, splayed her fingers through the soft nest of curling hair that framed his sex, and then she touched him. He jerked once, caught his breath. She took him in her hand, reveled in his low groan of pleasure. He was forged heat and pulsing need, thick and heavy with arousal. For her. Beneath her, his muscles tensed, then gathered, and the next thing she knew she was flat on her back again and he was looming over her. The full measure of his weight stretched out over her, chest to breast. His erection nestled in the V between her thighs as he kicked his pants and boxers to the floor. His elbows dug into the mattress on either side of her shoulders, his forearms caged her head as his hands tangled in her hair and he crushed his mouth to hers. She'd never felt so wanted. She'd never felt so much. She opened her legs for him, wrapped them around his hips and locked her ankles. Heat, hunger, need. She felt them in every pore of her body as his tongue mated with hers and his hips pumped into hers in a hard, rocking rhythm. He tore his mouth away, sucked in a ragged breath and swore. Protection. Please. He pressed his forehead to hers, his breath coming in hard, heavy gasps. Please tell me you've got something. She was too far gone to think about whether this was a good thing or a bad thing that he didn't carry condoms on the off chance he'd get lucky. And she was too needy to worry over what he would think about the fact that she had a full box of them in her nightstand drawer. Top drawer. Left. Hurry. He rolled off her and dragged open the drawer while she shimmied out of her panties. He was suited up and clenched-jawed when he turned back to her. She held out her arms, opened her legs, and he found a place for himself between them. "You deserve finesse," he apologized as he reached between them. "I promise next time, I'll make it up to you, but right now." She drew his mouth close to hers. "Right now. I need you to shut up," and she gasped as he hooked an arm behind her knee and pushed into her. Gasped again when he withdrew, then drove into her again and again in a hard, fast, earth-moving, heart-pounding rhythm. She'd barely caught her breath, hadn't catalogued the unbelievable depth of the pleasure when a climax so electric, so sustained, so off the charts powerful screamed through her body. She flew over the top on a gasping sob, swept up in a flood of sensations so fierce they were almost frightening, so consuming she was lost to anything but the feel of him moving inside her. Somewhere in the midst of this current of mindless bliss, she heard him call her name, heard him swear her name, then groan her name as he thrust one final time and found his own shattering release. When he could breathe again, when he could assimilate words into a cognitive stream of thought, when he could convince his muscles and his mind that he needed to roll off of her and give her some breathing room, Daniel still couldn't make himself move. He wanted to stay right where he was, buried inside of Phoebe Richards, for another millennium or two. By then maybe he'd have had enough of her. He waited another several heartbeats, then reluctantly levered his weight up on his elbows. "Are you still with me in there?" A small, dreamy smile tilted her lips. He pressed a kiss to one closed eyelid, then the other. "I could move, shush." One very limp hand lifted and with effort pressed an index finger against his lips. "No talking. Not yet." She stretched sinuously beneath him, exhaled on a deep, satisfied sigh. "Just let me ride the wave until I'm sure it's played out." He snagged her finger between his teeth. "And that was only the first wave. The seventh is the big one. Just think how long we can ride that one." Her eyes popped open. "Seventh?" He grinned. "Hi." She caressed his jaw, then raised her arms over her head and stretched again, long and lazy and cat-like. "Hi back." He lowered his head, kissed her sweet, swollen mouth. "You okay?" She pushed out a smug little laugh. "I'm perfect." "Yeah," he agreed softly. "You are." When she smiled up at him, another kind of wave, tenderness, washed over him. He thought, in that moment, that he could look at her face for hours. Listen to her sounds of pleasure for days. The thought of the sounds she would make when he loved her the way she deserved to be loved made him want to rectify that oversight as soon as humanly possible. "Me, on the other hand," he said, pulling out of her and easing up on an elbow so he could watch her face, "I get demerits for fast-forwarding to the end of the movie and missing all the good parts." "Good parts?" She let out another deep sigh. "Let's see. Technicolor, fireworks, surround sound, special effects. What other good parts could there possibly be?" "Well." He cupped her breast in his palm, loving the weight of her in his hand, the resiliency, the instant response as her nipple purled. "Here's a good part." He lowered his head, tasted. "A very good part. Oh." He slipped lower, pressing kisses to the underside of her breast, lingering over the adorable indentation of her navel that he couldn't resist exploring with his tongue. "And yet another good part." She struggled to hike herself up on her elbows, her expression stunned and electric with anticipation as he slid to his knees on the floor at the foot of the bed. When he bracketed her hips in his palms and dragged her to the edge of the mattress, she stopped breathing. "And here's the best part of all." He ran his tongue along the inside of her thigh, a slow glide from knee to just shy of that place he had yet to taste. Eyes locked on hers, he draped her legs over his shoulders. Then he lowered his head, nuzzled her damp curls, breathed in the scent of her and of him and of arousal. "The very best part," he murmured as his fingers opened her feminine folds and he finally tasted that wondrous place that defined her as a woman. It was sensual, swollen and so sensitive she came apart for him at that first intimate stroke. "Daniel," she gasped his name on a trembling sigh. "Shush." He gently bit the inside of a thigh, soothed her with a light brush of his fingertips over her belly. And when the tremors had ebbed and her breathing had leveled, he loved her all over again. Slowly now, taking his time, drawing out her pleasure, heightening her need until she begged him for release, then cried out in his arms when he gave it. Silk, he thought after he'd turned off the light, maneuvered them under the covers and drawn her snug against his side. Her skin was like silk. He lay in the dark, her slight weight pressed against him, her head on his shoulder, her bent knee nestled against his sleeping sex. And he wondered what he'd gotten himself into and how, when it was time, he was going to find it in him to get himself out. "It's not like you haven't had a guy sleepover before," Phoebe muttered to herself the next morning as she inventoried her refrigerator for the makings of omelets. Granted, it had been Leslie's grandson and he'd been 6 years old at the time, and he'd slept on her sofa in his Power Rangers PJs. Her cheeks flamed with heat. Daniel didn't sleep in PJs, although he could definitely fall into the Power Rangers category. A nervous laugh burst out. The things they had done in her bed. She flashed on a memory of his dark head at her breast, between her legs, and almost had a meltdown over the vegetable crisper. Snap out of it, she sputtered and started cracking eggs. She was a big girl. And now she had a lover. A lover. A goofy smile stretched her mouth. She hadn't been a virgin, but neither had she experienced anything like the pleasure Daniel had brought her last night. Several times. She covered her heated cheeks with her hands. Who knew that those red-hot love scenes she read in her romance novels weren't necessarily figments of the author's imaginations? And who knew that Daniel Barone could hold his own, and then some, with those fictional lovers who knew exactly where and how to touch a woman until he reduced her to a mindless, whimpering lump? Many, many times. Another river of heat sluiced through her blood. She honestly hadn't known she'd been capable of so many. Well, to sum it up concisely, until Daniel Barone landed in her bed, the only time multi had preceded a word describing her, it had been attached to tasking. She set a skillet on the burner, turned on the heat, and wondered if a person could become a nymphomaniac overnight. Then she wondered if nymphomaniac was a hyphenated word. If so, she would have two new hyphenated terms, nympho and multi, to add to her growing list of things she'd never been. And then she wondered if she was just plain nuts when she realized she'd thrown the eggshells in the bowl and the eggs in the garbage. She closed her eyes, drew a deep breath. Get a grip. She glanced at the clock. It was a little past 8:30. She'd been up long enough to take a quick shower, check to make sure Daniel was still sleeping, slip in a fresh set of contacts, check on Daniel again, fluff her hair, check on Daniel yet again, decide what to wear, and then change her mind 7 times, check on Daniel one final time, and have a nervous breakdown in her kitchen. By anyone's standards, it had been a pretty full morning. But nervous breakdown time was now officially over. She glanced down at her pink shorts and her pink tank top, under which she wore no bra because earlier she'd had another moment of insanity, and now she was afraid to go back in the bedroom and have him wake up and catch her in the act of changing. She looked fine. Except possibly for the condition of her nipples, which poked against her top like new erasers on number 2 lead pencils and more or less gave away what she'd been thinking about since she'd awakened with a beautiful naked man sprawled in her bed this morning. Help, she pleaded skyward and started over on the omelets. When both the yolks and the whites landed in the bowl this time, she took it as a good sign. When she heard the bathroom door open then close down the hall, she considered running out the back door. The dreaded morning after scene was only moments away. She'd thought it all out in the shower. She would play it casual. He was bound to have second thoughts. She wasn't going to cling. She wasn't going to come undone when he walked out the door. She was going to feed him, thank him for a lovely night, and wave goodbye with a smile. She could do this. She could. What she couldn't do when she heard his footsteps coming down the hall toward the kitchen was turn around. So she didn't. With unsteady hands, she poured her egg mix in the skillet. Smells good. His morning voice behind her was as gruff and smoky as she'd imagined. Ordering herself not to hyperventilate, she tossed her best Martha Stewart imitation over her shoulder. Hope you like omelets. Omelets sound great. I'm just not sure I'm dressed well enough for this obviously fine eating establishment. Keep it perky, she told herself. Well, we do have standards. No shirt, no shoes, she couldn't stand it anymore. She turned around, to see him standing there in nothing but his boxers. Her heart flat out stopped. No service? His lips quirked. She swallowed. No problem. He was so gorgeous. Sleekly tanned muscles, long, sinewy limbs, broad chest. His hair was so artlessly mussed, so melt-your-bones sexy, it made her want to cry. Coupled with the dark stubble of his morning beard, the penetrating blue of his eyes, he was a walking, talking erotic fantasy. And at the moment, he was her walking, talking erotic fantasy. She couldn't move. Couldn't speak. Could only watch as he moved around her table like a sleek, prowling cat and stopped directly in front of her. Turn it off, Phoebe. Turn it off? She thought desperately as her gaze fastened shamelessly on his mouth. I can't turn it off. Not if the it you're taking about is me. Not when you look like that. Not when you look at me like that. Dumbly, she followed the motion of his hand as he reached behind her and turned off the burner on the stove. Oh, she said. She added, articulate as ever. He relieved her of her spatula. Do you have to go to work today? She had an answer for that. And as soon as the sludge cleared out of her brain, she'd do her darndest to give it. He was grinning as he took her hand and, walking backward, led her out of the kitchen and down the hall toward the bedroom. 1 nod for yes, 2 for no, he instructed as if he was dealing with the village idiot. Which, of course, he was. Can you do that for me? She could. She did. Yes. You have to work? Another nod as they cleared the bedroom door. What time do you have to be there? She needed to blink, but she didn't want to miss even a nanosecond of the view. His smile was playful, his blue eyes teasing but telling what he had on his mind. So was the tempting action going on below the waistband of his boxers. Oh, joy. 10. She wet her lips and swallowed. 30. When the back of his knees hit the bed, so did the rest of him. He tugged her backward with him until she was sprawled on top of him. So what do you say? She wasn't the only one who shuddered when his hand tunneled up under her top and found her bare breast. You think I've got time to tip the cook? They have ways of making you talk. Leslie loomed over Phoebe's desk at noon that same day, a dark scowl in place, one eyebrow cocked in her best maniacal interrogator impersonation. Now you will tell me the truth if you ever vant to your homeland again. Did you or did you not get zome last night? Yes. Phoebe shouted in a dramatically staged confession, giving up and joining in on the silly game Leslie had been playing since Phoebe had stumbled into the library, loopy with love and muzzy-brained from amazing, me-weakening sex. I admit it. Is that what you wanted to hear? We did the big nasty. Satisfied? Leslie broke into a broad grin. The question is, are you? She laughed then and so did Phoebe. Okay. Asked and answered. So give. I need details. Phoebe slumped back in her chair, a happy, boneless lump, and hugged herself. Not a chance. It's way too good to share. Oh. Suddenly serious, Leslie eased a hip on the corner of the desk. You know what you're getting into here, don't you, sweetie? She asked softly. Recognizing her tone for concern, Phoebe sobered, drew a deep breath. I do. I'll be fine. And she would be. You've fallen in love with him, Leslie concluded gently. It wouldn't do any good to deny it. Yeah. I've fallen in love. And I'm going to enjoy every single moment of it for as long as it lasts. She rose, walked around her desk and tugged a resource book from the top of the bookshelf. If it's just for today, or for a week or however long Daniel wants it to last, I'm going to enjoy it. Leslie's silence relayed more apprehension. Look, Les, I'm not foolish enough to think that he loves me. He likes me. A lot. He likes making love to me, she added and felt her toes curl inside her shoes. But I don't have any illusions about where this is heading. No matter what Claudia and Ash had said last night, maybe even because of what they'd said, she'd taken a long look at things on her way to work and finally understood that Daniel did not want to fall in love with her. She rounded her desk, sat back down and hugged the book to her breast. He likes his life the way it is. He likes me because, unlike his family, I don't put any pressure on him to change. He can be himself with me, which means that he can leave when the wanderlust hits him or when he needs an adrenaline fix that can only be satisfied by climbing to the top of a mountain or diving off a cliff. She sniffed, ran her thumb along the book's binding. And I'm okay with that. I'm going to take whatever time he'll give me. Does that make me pathetic? She asked with a shrug, then answered her own question. I don't think so. I think that for the first time in my life it makes me brave. She met her friend's eyes. I'm tired of living on the world, Les. I want to live in it. I want to experience it. And I want every experience with Daniel Barone that I can get. Leslie let out a deep breath. He's a fool if he leaves you. No. He's a kind, funny, sexy, honest man. It wouldn't be honest for him to compromise who he is. And it wouldn't be fair for me to ask him to. Leslie forced a smile. Well, at least make sure that when he walks, if he walks, he knows he's walking away from the best thing that ever happened to him. Oh, I intend to, she said, her mind already wrapping around a scenario that would ensure she'd be on Daniel Barone's mind for a long, long time to come. Daniel lay in the dark, aware that Phoebe was awake beside him. It was after midnight on a Friday night. They were in his bed tonight. The Super King had added dimensions to their lovemaking that wouldn't have been possible in her standard double. So had their choice of reading material. Earlier, while she'd read an article in one of his National Geographic Explorers, he'd read a love scene from one of the romance novels she always carried with her in her purse. Well, what choice had he had? He'd had to take her back to bed and put his own spin on that hot little scene. Now she was soft, naked and as spent as he was. They'd just thoroughly exhausted each other again, so he didn't know what was keeping her awake. He had a pretty good handle, however, on the reason he was wide-eyed and restless. It was time he was moving on. Time to be moving out. He didn't have a single obligation that required his presence here in Boston. So why was it so hard to leave her? At first, he'd used the excuse that he was worried about her. But he'd hired a locksmith and her whole house was now as secure as Fort Knox. He'd spent some time at the police station and they'd promised him they'd have a little, off-the-record, chat with Jason Collins. He'd taught her everything he could think of to make sure she could defend herself against the creep. Then, he'd been sticking around for Karen's party. Well, that had passed over a week ago, just before he'd lost his mind completely and ended up in Phoebe's bed. Now he couldn't seem to get enough of her. And that was the part that worried him. He kept finding other reasons to stay. There was a new movie playing, one she actually wanted to see. Then he'd found out that she'd never been to a baseball game. Well, come on, it had been his duty to take her to Fenway. And then Claudia had called with extra tickets to a concert in the park. Phoebe loved concerts in the park. So, of course, he'd taken her. Yeah. He'd found a lot of things to do with her, but mostly they talked. God, he loved to talk to her. And they made love. She was so incredible. So open and responsive in bed, so undemanding out of it. She hadn't asked him about the future. But then, he hadn't expected her to. Not Phoebe. She'd never ask him for what he couldn't give. And he just couldn't be what she needed. There was really nothing else he could do, short of throwing a few things in his flight bag, hitting the road and picking up where he'd left off on a life he liked just fine, instead of lying here trying to fabricate some reason to stay a little longer. Yet when she sighed heavily beside him, his heart picked up a beat at the possibility that she might be about to say something, anything, that would make him change his mind. Something to give him a reason to stay a little longer. Just a little longer. Chapter 10. You're thinking awfully hard. What's on your mind? She turned her head on the pillow and with sleepy, sated eyes smiled up at him. I've just made a decision. Play it cool, Daniel told himself as he spread his fingers across her bare tummy and kneaded gently. You've decided that you like sex? Oh. She wrinkled her nose. It's okay, I guess. Ouch, she yelped then laughed when he tweaked her hip. If you're going to get all broody about it, I love sex. With you. Ditto. Such a way you have with words, she teased, turning on her side and smiling at him. He traced a finger around the shell of her ear. So, what's this big decision? Well, I've decided that life was not meant to be a spectator sport. She averted her gaze to his throat, as if she was debating what to say to clarify that statement. On a bracing breath, she met his eyes again. My mom is an alcoholic. Sometimes, when I was little, she was a mean one. She paused, looked away again. Sometimes she could be very generous and loving, but mostly, she was verbally abusive and cruel. No. She touched a hand to his jaw, then withdrew it and tucked it under her chin. Don't look like that. He knew how he looked. Angry and sorry and as though he wished he would have been around for her when she'd been going through that hell. I'm not telling you this to elicit sympathy. I just want you to understand that I learned real fast to sort of blend into the woodwork. It was great as a self-preservation technique, but the residual effects slopped over into the rest of my life. It's why I tend to watch from the shadows, too much of a coward to come out and play. Let me finish. She flattened 3 fingers against his lips this time when he started to interrupt her again. I have been a spectator. You, on the other hand, oh, how I wish I could be more like you. He kissed her fingertips, wrapped them in his hand. I can think of a number of reasons why I'm glad you're not. For instance, I like how you're so soft here. His hand found her breast under the sheet, then moved to cup and caress her saucy bottom. And here. Yeah, well, I like that you like that, but I was referring to the way you submerge yourself in life, the way you mix it up and dive right into the thick of things. You're so brave, Daniel. You aren't afraid to face down your greatest fears and then conquer them. He didn't even know what to say. He didn't think of himself as brave. Mostly he thought of himself as selfish. He did what he did because it was fun and because he had nothing, no commitment, no ties, keeping him from it. Now me, on the other hand. Well, watching the popcorn bag explode in my microwave is about as exciting as my life ever gets. She levered herself up on an elbow. I want to break the mold, she said decisively. I'm tired of me. I'm tired of my life. It's been nothing but an endless string of Seinfeld reruns. He couldn't help it. He laughed. Seinfeld? You know. That old sitcom about nothing? That's my life. Nothing. I want to do something to change it. Something wild, something scary. Something that convinces you about something I already know about you? That there's more to you than you've ever let yourself be, he concluded gently. Yeah. Exactly that. She lay down again, crossed her arms over her breasts and stared at the ceiling. She looked so cute in her determination, but he didn't want to make light of it. This was a huge decision for her. Anything particular come to mind? Anything that, she turned her head to look at him. That just the thought of doing scares me to death? Her eyes were so wide, so bright with thoughts of staring down her greatest fears that he had to smile. That'd be a start. So what are you thinking? There's a great roller coaster over at skydiving, she whispered, sounding as if she was afraid if she said it too loud, he might actually think she meant to do it. The funny thing was, he did. Skydiving? You're sure? He asked with a lift of his eyebrow. Are you kidding? I'm definitely not sure. But it's what I need to do. I can't think of anything that terrifies me more. He regarded her with new interest, understood the resolve she had mustered to even suggest the idea. He was going to do this for her, he decided right there and then. He was going to make sure she proved to herself just how brave she really was. Okay, he said and promised himself he wouldn't let her back out of it. I've got a friend just outside of Cambridge. He runs a skydiving school there. It's where I got certified. I'll set it up. How about this weekend? This weekend? She squeaked as he lifted her, then shifted her until she was straddling him in all of her soft, naked glory. We'll jump tandem the first time. I'll be with you every inch of the way. The first time? He took her mind off her fear then. And took his mind off leaving. She'd just given him his reason to stay a little longer. Just a little longer, he promised himself as she settled over him, onto him, and took him deep. As the 4-passenger Cessna bumped down the runway, Phoebe sat on the floor where the seats used to be and tried to think about how blue the sky was overhead. She didn't look at the big hole in the side of the plane that was covered only by a roll of canvas with plastic windows and held in place by Velcro. Soon that canvas was going to be rolled up and she was going to, oh, God. She couldn't think about it. So she stared at the sign on the back of the pilot's seat. Sit down, shut up and hang on. Well, that wasn't a problem. She had to sit, her legs wouldn't support her. She couldn't talk, she was scared speechless. And hang on? Like she would even consider letting go? Relax. Beside her, in his black jumpsuit, helmet and goggles, Daniel squeezed her knee, then double-checked the harness that would soon bind them together. You're going to love this. She reached deep for a smile. When he laughed, she knew how unconvincing she'd been. She did not love this. She did not love knowing that they were going to jump into space at 11,000 feet and that the pilot would slow the plane to around 90 miles an hour, then cut the engine just before they jumped, which, in effect, gave them 2 chances to die on this little quest to rub out her yellow streak. Another sign, this one above the canvas that was loosely referred to as a door, caught her terrified attention as they lifted off the runway. If riding in an airplane is flying, then riding in a boat is swimming. If you want to experience the element, get out of the vehicle. She so did not want to get out of the vehicle. Not now that it was about to leave the ground. She closed her eyes and tried not to watch as the earth fell away and her stomach went into a marathon pitch and roll. Yes, she'd sat through the instructional video, and yes, it made her feel a little better to know that Daniel was a veteran of over 200 jumps and was a certified instructor. It was the actual diving to the ground part that was giving her trouble. Okay, Phoebe, it's time. Already? Oh God. Funny thing about absolute terror. It affected everyone differently. In Phoebe's case, it made her as malleable as a lump of clay. She sat like a slug as Daniel rolled up the canvas, then physically turned her toward the jump door before he sat down behind her, straddling her hips with his legs. Everything registered in a blur then as he hooked them together and the pilot yelled over his shoulder, "Are you ready to skydive?" To which Daniel yelled back, "Yes." And the next thing she knew, her heart was in her throat and they were free falling through space. The following 60 seconds were a terrifying, exhilarating, breath-stealing blur. And then they were at 4,000 feet and Daniel had pulled the rip cord on the parachute. Suddenly, everything was silent and peaceful. She felt as if she was in suspended animation as they floated slowly toward the ground. And there was no more fear. Just a glorious, spectacular descent made sweeter by the notion that quite possibly she wasn't going to die after all. She heard a voice, possibly hers, say, "This is incredible." And then, in a landing so soft a baby would have slept through it, they were on the ground. She was crying softly when Daniel unhooked their harness and started reeling in the chute. When he turned her to face him, she threw herself into his arms. "Thank you. Oh, thank you, thank you, thank you." He was grinning from ear to ear when she pulled away, wiping tears from her eyes. "When can we do it again?" she asked. "Do you think I could go solo next time?" Phoebe was still pumped on an adrenaline high the next morning. She left Daniel in bed and jumped in the shower. After setting the coffee on to brew, she threw on an old tank top and cutoffs and headed for her studio in the basement. Yesterday had been one wild day, the night had been even wilder. Once she'd made that first jump, she'd had to do another and then another. Never, ever, in her entire life had she experienced such unqualified exhilaration and such a sense of accomplishment. She couldn't begin to put it into words. She'd been bouncing off the walls when they returned to Boston and her bed last night. And then, well, the thrills had started all over again. Her life, suddenly, was the stuff that romance novels were made of, and she was living every glorious moment to the fullest. She'd just centered her clay on the potter's wheel and her hands were gunky with slurry when she heard the stairs creak under the weight of Daniel's footsteps. A shiver of anticipation eddied through her. How could she want him again, after the way they'd spent the night tangled and sweaty in each other's arms? Maybe because she was a different person now than she'd been before Daniel had charged into her life and saved her not only from Jason, but from spending the rest of her days in a dull and colorless void. "Good morning," he said softly as he came up behind her. His voice was husky. From those two little words, she understood that she wasn't the only one with raging hormones this morning. "Ever see that old Demi Moore movie Ghost?" he asked, sitting down behind her. The inside of his thighs were warm and hard against the outside of hers. His bare arms were encompassing and strong as he wrapped them around her midriff, pulled her back and against him and lowered his head to nuzzle her neck. Oh, yeah. She'd seen it. In fact, she'd bought her potter's wheel shortly after seeing the film. No, she lied and leaned back against him, loving the feel of his warm, naked chest against her back, the cocooning warmth of his arms around her. "Any particular reason that I should have?" She felt his smile against the curve where her neck met her shoulder and knew that he knew she was lying. "Oh, there's this one scene. I've always had this fantasy about playing it out." Well, far be it from me to kill a man's fantasies. There wasn't much talking after that. But there was a lot of soaping and rinsing and soaping again after they'd made Randy love and stumbled to the shower to wash away the mess they'd made of each other. When he left her at her door early Monday morning with a lingering kiss, Phoebe couldn't imagine what her life had been like before Daniel. Just as she could no longer imagine it without him. Daniel was shaving when his doorbell rang. Snagging his jeans and quickly tugging them on, he slung a towel over his shoulder. "Hey, come on in," he said, grinning as he swung open the door to his sister Emily and her fiancé, Shane Cummings, whom he had finally met at Karen's welcome party. "Want some coffee?" he asked after he'd excused himself to pull on a shirt. "No thanks, we've only got a minute," Emily said. "But we want to ask you something. It was so crowded at Karen's party we didn't get a chance to corner you then. Or catch up with you since," Shane, whom Daniel had liked immediately, added with a grin. "You're one busy man." "Busy? No." "Wrapped up in Phoebe?" "Yes." And he had to do some serious thinking about that. "So what's up?" he asked as the thought niggled away in the back of his mind. "Well," Emily began with a smiling glance at Shane, "we want to ask you if you'll stand up with us at the wedding." "I'd be honored," he said, pleased for both of them. "As a matter of fact, I'd have been disappointed if you hadn't asked." Shane extended his hand. "That's great. Thanks. Maybe Shane will be able to return the favor soon?" Emily's expectant grin froze Daniel's smile. "Return the favor? You and Phoebe. You looked so great together at the party." "I liked her, Daniel. I liked her a lot. Everyone did." "Whoa." He held up a hand as an almost suffocating pressure expanded in his chest. "You know me better than that." "Phoebe, well, she's very special, but marriage?" "No." His sister took his hands in hers. "Why not marriage? Why not with Phoebe?" "Because he didn't do commitment, that was why. Because there wasn't a woman in the world, even Phoebe, who could put up with his lifestyle. And because there wasn't a woman in the world he'd give it up for. Even Phoebe." Panic raced through his blood. Is that what everyone thought? That he was ready to settle down? Ready to commit to someone who would depend on him to be there? Someone who would want to make babies with him, to tuck those babies in at night and be there when they woke up in the morning? More important, was that what Phoebe thought? Yes, he realized with a horrible sinking sensation in his chest. That was exactly what she thought. I think maybe we'd better be going, Shane said, and Daniel realized he must have zoned out on them completely. He was still only half there as he walked them to the door, smiled the requisite smile, and exchanged goodbyes. He leaned back against the door, stared hard at the floor. Wasn't that always the way it was? It took someone on the outside looking in to draw the picture, flesh it out, and jar things into perspective. Things had gotten out of hand. Things that he'd known better than to start in the first place because he didn't have it in him to finish them. And yet he'd done it anyway. He wiped a hand over his jaw. It was going to be hard. Really hard. But he knew what he had to do. And he knew he had to do it today. The longer he stayed, the more he would hurt her. And hurting Phoebe was the last thing he'd ever wanted to do. Nice job, hotshot, he muttered as he pushed away from the door. Phoebe looked up from her desk at the library when a soft rap sounded at her door. It's open. Daniel. She broke into a smile when he poked his head inside. Hi. Hi, he said, and stepped all the way into the room. That was when she saw the flight bag slung over his shoulder. Later she would remember exactly how her body reacted to the conclusion her mind had so quickly and accurately drawn. The dizzying rush. The sense of absolute sorrow. It was like being swept away by a wave of loss and longing. Like the blood in her head had narrowed and drained, down her cheeks and past her throat, then sucked the warmth from her fingers as it converged to the pit of her stomach and left her heart empty. She stood up slowly, amazed that her legs could support her. You're leaving. He drew in a breath, let it out. And he wouldn't look at her. Yeah. Something's come up. She waited for him to meet her eyes. When he finally did, she understood. He wasn't just leaving, he was running away. From her. From them. There's this dive. He rolled a shoulder, walked to the bookshelf, fingered a leather binding. It's off the coast of Tahiti. Something I've been wanting to get in on for a couple of years now. She watched him in silence, feeling vulnerable and confused and suddenly angry. She shouldn't ask. When will you be back? He was slow to turn around and face her. When he did, she understood why. He wasn't coming back. Not to her. Phoebe, what we've had together, I'll never forget it. You are an incredible woman. Any man would be lucky to have you. But Phoebe, I never should have gotten involved with you. I was being selfish. I knew going into this that it was temporary. I guess I'd hoped we both did. He stopped, swore under his breath. God, tell me to shut up. I'm botching this. I sound like every creep who's ever dumped someone. She concluded and saw by the guilt clouding his eyes. That was exactly what he'd been trying not to say. Phoebe, I am so sorry. I never meant to hurt you. Please understand that. I don't think you're asking for understanding, Daniel, she said, beyond pain for the moment. It was temporary, she knew. It would be back, but right now she was numb. And she was angry. I think you're asking for forgiveness. And the funny thing is, a week ago I would have given you both. A week ago I would have been willing to take whatever you gave me until you left. Well, guess what? I'm not the same woman I was a week ago. I hadn't been loved by you then. And you hadn't been loved by me. It was surprising how calm she felt. Amazing how sure. Once I was afraid to experience life and you taught me how to overcome that fear. Interesting how that worked out. Now you're the one who's afraid. He worked his jaw, looked away. If denial had a name, it was, in this moment, Daniel Barone. His inability to look at her told her how desperate he was to get away from the truth. There was nothing she could do, nothing she could say to make him see it. When he only repeated, I never meant to hurt you, she knew he was as good as lost to her. So you said. You never meant to fall in love with me either, she added with a sadness that left her empty, but you did. Of that she was sure. She'd never been more sure of anything in her life. And now you're running scared. She actually managed a smile then. It's kind of funny, really. Once, I didn't think I was woman enough for you. It was a challenge. Prove to me that you're man enough for me. Stay. But of course, he didn't. She closed her eyes when he came to her, touched a hand to her hair, then let it slowly fall away. Be safe, Phoebe. Remember what I taught you. Oh, I'll remember. He didn't see the single tear trail down her cheek. He was already out the door. I'll always remember. Falling in love was awfully simple. Falling out of love was simply awful. During the next week, Phoebe understood those words as she never had before. Her emotions ran the gamut from anger to understanding to grief. She was angry with Daniel for his sudden retreat and his inability to admit his feelings for her. But it made her realize that she wasn't the only one who was sometimes afraid. Did she forgive him for leaving her? No. But she did try her best to understand. Claudia Barone didn't understand. She'd shown up at the library on the Friday after he'd left, just as Leslie and Carol were set on dragging her off to a bar to drown her sorrows. That had been 5 hours ago and Phoebe had had enough. Don't go home, Phoebe, not yet. We just got started. Above the vibrating beat of a bass guitar and the heavy metal licks slamming out of the jukebox, Claudia and Leslie echoed Carol's protest with an enthusiastic, "Yeah, don't go." Do you know how long it's been since this old woman has had a girls' night out? Leslie whined, although Phoebe knew she was fussing for her benefit. When they continued to make noises about her staying, Phoebe held a hand in the air to quiet them down. Come on, guys. I have to work tomorrow. And I have to get out of here, she said to herself. The Tycoon, or any bar, for that matter, wasn't her scene. But the three women had insisted. They meant well. She hadn't known how to put them off without hurting their feelings, but she'd made more than an appearance and now it was time to beg off. I've gotta go, she persisted to their round of good-natured boos. But it's late as night, Carol reminded her with a turn of her head that encompassed the bar packed with 9-to-5ers ducking in out of the heat, looking for some wind-down time or a little action at the end of long work week. Who knows? You might get lucky. Phoebe snorted. Lucky is a relative term. They're not all like Jason. Carol's expression was sympathetic but firm when Phoebe stood to go. Or Daniel. No offense, Claudia, I know he's your brother but, none taken, Claudia agreed. It's okay. Phoebe dug into her purse for some tip money for the waitress. She nodded toward the crowded bar. They're all yours, ladies, and I use the term loosely, she added with a grin. If you find one, kiss a prince for me, okay, 'cause lately, all I've bumped up against are frogs. I thought you said that guy you went out with Wednesday night was a leprechaun, Leslie said, referring to Sam Spaulding who had been after Phoebe for months. In a weak and defiant moment, she'd finally agreed. Leprechaun. Frog. Same difference. They're both tiny, they're both green and neither qualify as princes. Not that he necessarily has to be a prince, Leslie and Carol chimed in, then laughed as they finished their standing joke together. A white knight'll do. White knight. Yeah, well, white knights weren't all they were cracked up to be either, Phoebe thought as she waved goodbye. Smoke, stale air and the rocking sounds of Sheryl Crow followed her outside into the hot Boston night. She'd just reached her car, which she'd parked a couple blocks from the Tycoon under a streetlight that she hadn't noticed was burned out, when she realized she was no longer alone. She turned quickly. And there was Jason, looking angry and mean and more than a little drunk. A sickening sense of déjà vu washed over her as he walked toward her. I've been looking for you, Mouse. It surprised her to realize she didn't feel fear. What she felt was unmitigated, undeniable anger. And what she knew was that she was done being his victim. Go away, Jason. She dismissed him and started digging in her purse for her keys. Don't turn your back on me. When his hand clamped on her shoulder, she didn't think. She just reacted. She whirled around, slammed the flat of her hand into his face and hiked her knee into his chest. He made a surprised oomph and wobbled off balance, and when he doubled over, she went in for the kill. She drove her foot into his diaphragm and sent him sprawling on his back. Before he'd even realized she'd knocked him flat, she had her pepper spray in her hand and her foot on his throat. What the hell? "Hey, Mouse," he whined. "That's Mighty Mouse to you." Filled with a stunning sense of pride that she'd been able to defend herself against Jason's bullying, she let him have it. "And this is the last time you're going to bother me. But I miss you. I need you. You need help, Jason." She dug into her purse again, searching for her cell phone so she could call 911. "You need help," she said more kindly, then frowned when she couldn't come up with her phone. "Looking for this?" The deep voice came from behind her. She didn't have to see the man to recognize the source. She'd know that voice anywhere. In the dark, in the light, at 11,000 feet, whispering encouragement in her ear. Slowly, she looked down to the cell phone that lay in the palm of Daniel Barone's hand. "It flew out when you put the moves on him." For a moment, all she could do was stare at his hand. It took more courage to look up than it had taken to drop Jason to his back. "So, guess you don't need me to save you anymore, huh?" Her heart flipped, tripped, stumbled and fell at the caress in his voice. She met his eyes with hope and longing and just enough uncertainty to undercut it all. "No," she said carefully, "I guess I don't. I might be good for other things, though." He watched her face with those intense blue eyes that she'd dreamed about every night since she'd met him. "Such as?" "Well, for starters, such as showing up at the right place, at the right time and dialing 911. Chapter 11. Phoebe had to drive down to the police station to press charges. Since she now had the proof she needed, she also filed a restraining order against Jason. Before she left, however, she asked to see him. She felt minimally relieved when she finally extracted a promise from him to get involved with some kind of program to help with his problem. Daniel never left her side. She wasn't sure what to make of that. Just as she wasn't sure what to make of him following her home, or his explanation that he just happened to be driving by when he saw her. "So how was Tahiti?" she asked when time had stretched taut and the sound of Arthur purring on her lap was the only thing interrupting the tentative silence of her living room. "Tahiti?" He lifted a shoulder and met her eyes from the sofa where he'd settled. "Never quite made it. Could a heart actually survive all the thumping it had undergone tonight?" She wondered. Could he see it, slamming against her breast? Could he see the nervousness in her eyes as she sat across from him and by the slimmest thread of pride kept from dropping to her knees and begging him to love her? About those other things. Through the maelstrom of emotions swirling inside her, she heard but didn't comprehend his statement. "Other things? You know, those other things that I might be good for, since you don't need me to protect you anymore." "Oh." She must have squeezed Arthur a little too hard because he jumped off her lap with an indignant snap of his tail. Did you, want to elaborate?" He clasped his hands between his splayed knees and stared at the steeple he'd made of his thumbs. "Well, I might be good at being your friend." When he looked up, she willed herself not to cry. She'd already been there. They'd already done that. She couldn't be his buddy again. It hurt that much more to think he'd shown up like this, given her hope and then expected her to, "I've missed you, Phoebe." The gruff sincerity in his voice brought the tears she'd worked so hard to keep from forming. They misted her eyes and she tried desperately to blink them back. "I've missed my friend. I know it's been less than a week, but I've missed you every day. Every hour. I've missed the woman I could talk to, the woman I could laugh with and who never asked me to be something I didn't want to be." He was pouring his heart out because he needed her to be the one thing she couldn't be. And he was killing her. "I've missed the woman I made love to. The woman I fell in love with." It was another one of those moments that she knew she'd remember as long as she lived. "The woman I fell in love with." She covered her mouth with her hand and begged him on a choked whisper, "Please. Don't do this. Don't say this if you don't plan to stay." Through a blur of tears, she watched him drop to his knees in front of her. He gathered her hands in his, pressed his lips to her ice-cold knuckles. "I do love you, Phoebe. I've loved you from the first time I saw you." The sob broke then as she looked down on his dark head bending over her hands. I don't know how it happened. I wasn't going to let it. But I think I was a goner the first time I saw you wearing that hot red toenail polish and grinning over a vanilla ice cream cone. She stopped fighting, stopped denying that she'd heard him wrong, that she would wake up and find this was just another one of her dreams. His eyes, when he lifted his head and met hers, told her how very real this was. He loved her. She threw herself into his arms, hung on for her life. Shush. Shush, baby, he said. Don't cry. I'm so sorry I was so stupid. I tried. Lord, I tried to convince myself I was hanging around to protect you, and then I started fabricating any excuse I could come up with to stay. And that scared the hell out of me. And it doesn't scare you anymore? He pushed out a laugh and set her gently away from him. Bracketing her face in his hands, he wiped away her tears with a sweep of his thumbs. It scares me to death. I don't know if I'll be any good at this commitment thing, Phoebe. But I'm going to give it everything I have. I learned something recently. This beautiful, wiser, older woman taught me that by confronting my fears, my life could be so much richer. He brought her hands to his mouth. Marry me, Phoebe. Tonight? She laughed through her tears. Tonight? Okay. So that's rushing it. Tomorrow, then. But don't make me wait any longer. I have so many things I want to show you. So many places I want to take you. We'll start at the family compound in Harwich Port. I want to honeymoon with you there, where I can get my fill of you in a bed, in a bath, in the kitchen. Hell, I want you everywhere. I want to make love to you under the stars at the Cape. He stopped, laughed. Say yes, Phoebe, and it'll be just you and me and several days of showing you how sorry I am that I hurt you and how much I love you. Yes. Yes, yes, yes. He drew her into a long, drugging kiss that told her as much about how he loved her as the amazing words he'd just spoken. You're the best adventure I've ever had, Phoebe Richards, he said, scooping her into his arms and carrying her toward the bedroom. And you're the only one I'll ever need. She laughed again with pure, unbridled joy. But what if I want to see Borneo? He planted a knee on the bed, then eased her to her back and started dragging off his shirt. Then I'll take you to Borneo. Better yet, I'll take you to the Galapagos. He grinned as he started working on her slacks. You'll love it. They have turtles. Not only didn't I make it to Tahiti, Daniel confessed later as they lay in each other's arms, I didn't even make it out of Boston. Oh, I was going, at least I thought I was, but I just kept coming up with reasons to stay. What kind of reasons? She asked as she trailed her fingers back and forth over his chest. Well, after I left you at the library, I went back to my place. I'd decided I'd forgotten something. I hadn't, but hey, I was in total denial and it was another excuse to postpone leaving. Anyway, Ash happened to drop by as I was on my way out for the second time. And he laid into me good. About me? Yeah, he said, squeezing her arm. About you. Phoebe thought of everything the sheikh had said to her at Karen's party. She had no doubt that he could be very convincing. He'd certainly convinced Karen that he wanted to stake a claim when he'd kissed her. Bless you, Ash, she said silently. And good luck. Anyway, he said I couldn't leave. Made up some pretense of needing to go over my portfolio. I knew what he was doing. He was giving me time to think through the panic, and I was just desperate enough for another reason to stay that I let him convince me. And then there was Claudia. Phoebe lifted up on her elbow so she could see his face. Claudia? Yeah, Our Lady of the Eternal Lost Cause. He tucked a drift of hair behind her ear. She took over where Ash left off. And as long as I'm confessing, I didn't just happen by the bar tonight. Claudia was a plant. A plant? He pulled her back down beside him. Don't be mad, but I sent her to the library to test the waters this afternoon. When your friends were determined to take you out, she went with the flow and invited herself along. You didn't notice that she left the table several times? Well, yeah, but, oh. She was calling you, wasn't she? Giving you a play-by-play. And that's how you just happened to be there. He nodded and tucked her head beneath his chin. I was so proud of you when you flattened that creep. I was proud of me too. Her bedroom grew quiet again before Daniel finally spoke. Can you ever forgive me for being such a fool? Could she forgive him? How could she make him understand that she already had? I think, she said, as it came to her, that this story will answer your question. Once upon a time, she began, making up her romantic fairy tale as she went, there was a handsome, fearless knight. He'd slain many dragons, conquered many evil foes, and was known throughout the land for his brave deeds and stalwart courage. There was only one thing the White Knight feared. He was afraid to trust his heart to a princess for safekeeping. He shifted to his side, caressed her face with his hand, with his eyes. I think I know this guy. He was a bigger fool than I was. No, he was very wise. One day, she continued, snuggling against him so that her lips brushed his throat when she spoke. The handsome knight was struck from his horse in the heat of battle. He landed so hard that his heart spilled right out of his chest. And as he lay there, watching it beat, exposed and vulnerable, who do you think was there to pick it up and give it back to him, proving that he could trust her to keep it safe? He stroked his hand down the length of her back and made her shiver. His princess? No. It was a turtle. But the knight didn't care. He was so happy to have his heart back safe and sound that he kissed the turtle, who had pretty pink cheeks. He interrupted with a smile so tender it brought tears again, and she was really a princess under the spell of an evil witch. Wrong again, she said patiently and tipped her head up so she could see his face. He was right not to trust the princess because his true love was the turtle who, as you said, was under a spell. When the prince kissed the turtle, she transformed into a librarian who had given up waiting for her white knight to come and save her from an empty and lonely life. His eyes were as misty as hers now. And did he save her, Phoebe? She cupped his face in her hands, loving the feel of his stubbled jaw against her palms, the beauty that made him Daniel. She let him save her because it was important to his ego. She felt his love and his trust wrap around her as surely as the arms that held her. I think I know how this ends, he whispered, moving over her. And the knight and the beautiful librarian spent the rest of their lives in an enchanted kingdom, with Arthur the cat, where they all lived happily ever after. She smiled into his eyes, secure in his love, empowered by his trust and, as always, stunned by the depth of his need. Very happily ever after,